what all of us have to consider is the discussion we're about to embark on is probably something that you didn't quite expect, which is the nature of, fundamentally what the nature of our nation was built on, which is the science of the human mind. And the fact that each and every one of us is endowed with a potential for true creativity. And that the system that supports that should help to facilitate the development of creativity. What we're seeing today is a complete slash across the board. And I think those of us that are here have developed a certain patriotic intolerance to that. And there's a reason why this room isn't filled with 500 to 1,000 people, is because solutions, like the quality of the solution that we're fighting for, will really take a few exceptional individuals to follow through, to really make it happen. And I think we should see ourselves as that. We shouldn't see ourselves as just people that are going to talk about some type of policy or rights for this or rights for that, but really elevate the discussion to the level that we need to in order to solve the problem and address the crisis. So to do that, we flew Phil Rubenstein out from New Jersey, out from the East Coast. And he's been a worker and collaborator with my boss, Lyndon LaRouche, for how many years?
About 45.
Okay, I underestimated. I said about maybe 38, but it's 45, so even more. And I've been with Mr. LaRouche for 11 years. So without further ado, I'd like him to discuss, open up the discussion, and of course, after that, we'll be opening up for your discussion. Bring to the table what you're thinking, and we can create the discussion that way. So welcome, Phil.
Okay. Yeah, I think just on the timing, I guess we have the room till about 2, so hopefully we'll have plenty of time for discussion if I don't rattle on too long. But I think there's a number of ways to start on this question that Miwa raised. You know, what are we as the United States? What makes us, you know, I guess Obama recently said the American exceptionalism is that we have the right to go around telling people what to do and so on and so forth. But that's not American exceptionalism. That's not what, in fact, if anything, the word American exceptionalism meant the opposite. It meant we didn't view ourselves as being an empire. We didn't view ourselves as going around imposing things on people, the right to protect, which has become a policy these days. The idea was indeed that we were going to build a republic that had as its form of developing the consent of the population a democracy. But the republic was first. It was a republic that was also a democracy. They're not the same thing. And the United States was never built simply on the idea of majority rule. But it was built on the idea of a certain kind of discussion in the population which protected the rights of certain individuals and minorities, but also had a national policy that was agreed upon effectively by the nation. It was, for example, it's an interesting patriotic song. That's a Union song. I think if you sang that song in some places to this day in the South, you might not get the greatest response, because we still have, in many ways, a Confederate problem that was never resolved. So, but we need a unified nation. This is not a question of, this is not a question of states and states' rights. In fact, I find one of the interesting things before I get to a couple of points I want to start with is, you look at today and the problem in the culture and in the United States today. You've got, on the one hand, an outlook which is borrowed from the Anglo-Dutch Empire. For example, the economist, who's referred to as the authority in American policy today by people like Ben Bernanke, Obama himself. These guys are basically British liberals, what used to be called a British liberal. The leading economist is Adam Smith. free enterprise. Anybody who knows the Anglo-Dutch Empire knows that what they meant by free enterprise was we were free to force you to produce an economy of natural resources which we might manufacture. We protected the British Empire. In fact, up to World War II, the debate between FDR and Churchill, a guy who should not be a hero in the United States, but is amongst a large section of the population. The debate between FDR and Churchill was over imperial preferences. One of the debates was colonial preferences. That is, Churchill wanted free trade to apply to the British Empire vis-a-vis the rest of the world. But within the empire, they had the right to have tariffs, protection, special trade relations, because it was one empire. In fact, there's a kind of a funny irony when one of the things that's brought up is that, you know, the Soviets tried to get every one of the Soviet republics have a representative in the United Nations. And that didn't happen. Roosevelt was against it and so forth. But one of the answers that Churchill had was, well, then every member of the Commonwealth, well, it wasn't the Commonwealth yet, but right before the Commonwealth, should have a representative. And you should recognize that what was the idea of the Commonwealth, which we refer to today? The Commonwealth represents 30 to 40% of the world's population. People think there isn't an Anglo-Dutch Empire. Now, where did this come from? Basically, there was a debate amongst the British imperial circles about how to deal with the modern era. That indeed, the form of empire of the 19th century wasn't necessarily the best idea. And they had gone through the problems of the 20th century and so forth, so they formed the Commonwealth, which was a new form of empire, relatively speaking. A financial empire, a political empire, and of course a great deal of the policy, and one of the reasons Churchill was chosen was because they wanted to control the United States. They wanted the control of the financial system and even more of the culture. So our financial system and our culture increasingly over the latter part of the 20th century, in particular, it really begins at the beginning of the 20th century, was consciously a change in the culture of the United States, away from the American system of economic development, physical economic development, the actual increase in the intellectual powers of the citizenry of the United States, the creativity, the human mind. And this is what Hamilton addresses. He makes the point in the founding economic documents of the United States that the critical element is the development of the human mind, even beyond artificial machinery, agriculture, and so forth, is that all of that progresses as the human mind progresses. I always think also the way words get destroyed. You know, in the preamble of the Constitution, it says that one of the things we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, and I can't quote things that well, but you know, and in order to guarantee our security, our liberty, and our general welfare for us and our posterity. Now, I think that gives you, that's the principle of the American Constitution. Fundamentally, that's what you need to know what the American Constitution means. Everything else is details. You know, Einstein once said, what I want to know is the mind of God. The rest is details. I want to know the principles by which this was created. And it's true, people get hung up on every little jot and tittle. And then, you know, there's some relevance in it. But the preamble says, what is the country built on? We're a union of people who are to guarantee security, liberty, and the general welfare. Now think of the word general welfare today. What do most people think of when they think of welfare? You know, you have the supposed, you know, the welfare queen and the Cadillac. You know, I mean, Ronald Reagan had his good points and his bad points, but that was a bit of a stretch. I don't think most people on welfare, you know, everybody comes up with so-and-so did this and so-and-so. I'm sure there were people who were corrupt. But, you know, most of the people on welfare were on welfare. They didn't have Cadillacs. Let me give you another example of where we are today. Because I think people, arguably you can say, well, people didn't do certain things. Right now, the United States ranks second in amongst developed nations, relatively developed nations, in the percentage of children who live in poverty. And I mean poverty. Poverty in the sense that they don't know where the next meal is coming from, or many days in the week they don't have a next meal. I'm talking about children, not welfare queens. Second, you know what the worst country is? Romania. So we rank right after Romania in the percentage of poor children in the United States. Now, if people know Romania, Romania was amongst one of the most backward nations in the Soviet Republic. And that's the situation today. Take New York City, or take Los Angeles. We have the highest rate of homelessness amongst children since any time in the Depression. In New York City and Los Angeles, you have about 50,000, 60,000 homeless. Close to half of them are children. And you should realize many of these are people who have jobs, but the jobs don't pay much. And I'll get to this point. This is a monetarist society. Obama, where does he come from? The Chicago School. This is the hardcore school of free enterprise. The Friedrich von Hayek school. That no government, the government's just there to be a policeman. There's no policy, there's no principle. It's a dog-eat-dog world. That's where Obama comes from. Obama's whole view is behavioral economics. That's the point of the Obamacare. The idea is you create a system which is supposed to be Obamacare, which is really basically a bailout for the insurance companies. It's another bailout of Wall Street. People sometimes refer to Obama as a communist. If he's a communist, then this is a communism for bankers. It's a banker's communism. They're the only ones that seem to get welfare. If you've noticed, Medicare is being cut, pensions are being cut, Social Security they want to cut, but we're prepared to spend trillions of dollars on the banks. And there's an interesting point to understand what monetarism is when you see what this is. Because this money is worthless. It's zero. It has no value. Virtually the banking system of the United States, the 6 leading banks that control 58% of the deposits, they've actually grown since the crisis, since 2008. As Elizabeth Warren makes the point. They've increased 30% since too big to fail. They got too bigger to fail. This is what we got with I'll come back to Dodd-Frank, the Volcker Rule, and so on and so forth. The reality that we have to face, but I think this is one that really has to be faced. Number one, the United States is on a completely declining path in 2 phases, really. It really began with the death of FDR. And we had Truman, who was basically a creature of Churchill, and so on and so forth. And of course, this became locked in, you might say, to the culture with the assassination of Kennedy. And I would say the assassination of Kennedy and the cover-up. Because this thing, there was never anything satisfactory done on what happened in the Kennedy assassination, and then obviously soon after, not long after, King and his brother, Kennedy's brother. And we don't know, and the fact is we've forgotten what the country was like. And I'll start with something very interesting and give you an idea. Yeah, people do remember a little bit, and there's more to it. Kennedy, of course, said we're going to go to the moon. And we went to the moon. And actually, if you listen to some of his speeches, I won't go into every detail. We have a report called JFK, the President from the Future, which details a lot of his policies, which have been forgotten. The one that's remembered somewhat is the moonshot. But if you look at what he had to say. He said this was going to be the prelude to developing the moon and perhaps reaching into the further reaches of the solar system. We never went there. We never went there. The last time we were on the moon was 1972. That's now 41 years ago. And we haven't been back. And we have no plan to get there. You know, Obama said, well, you know, been there, done that. I mean, you know, you have to wonder a little bit. Okay? Now, but Kennedy was in favor of nuclear development, nuclear rockets, water projects, desalination. These were all projects that Kennedy proposed. Take California. He was out here toward the end of his administration, before he got assassinated. And what do you need in California? Water. You can't develop the American West without water. Everything west of the Mississippi is what they call the 20-inch rain line. It's the Great American Desert. It ain't the Sahara, but it's got some bad places in it. So what do you need? You need to develop water management. We did a little bit under Roosevelt, and a little before Roosevelt, and then afterwards. The Hoover Dam, up north the Grand Coulee Dam, the beginnings of the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Tennessee Valley Authority. And then we stopped. We've had no new water projects in the West in years, decades, since Kennedy. We have no, in California, since 1990, the population has grown by about over 10 million people. The amount of usage of electricity has stayed the same. Now, that means that the amount of electricity per capita has gone down by about 30%, 20 to 30%. Now, some people are proud of it because Californians are proud that they're much better on conservation. And there might be a little bit of use in the conservation. And we're not going to argue about every point. But what did we lose? Aerospace, no infrastructure development, no increase in water management. We're shutting down scientific projects, and I'll come to this. Because so what's happened since Kennedy? Nothing. We've become a monetarist. What's the issue? Supposedly there's no money. And a lot is going on in Starbucks. You do have to ask it. I'll give you some ironies in this. And to show you how foolish we are. No money. Foolishness. We need small government. We need, Herbert Hoover said we needed small government. Yeah. And this government got so small, the country was almost destroyed. And what did it take? A Republican government under a Democratic president, FDR, virtually everything people know as infrastructure in the United States began under FDR. We didn't finish it until the 50s or 60s. The TVA wasn't finished until the 50s. The water projects in California weren't finished until the 60s under Pat Brown and company. There's never been a serious nationwide project that wasn't initiated by the federal government. The moonshot was the federal government. Nuclear power was the federal government. I don't know, people may have wanted to fight World War II with private armies. I don't think we would have done that well. Yes, you can bring industry to bear. Private entrepreneurship will flourish when there is a mission orientation in the economy. When there's a purpose to what you're doing. Otherwise, they're going to look for the cheapest way. What happened with electricity in the United States? Good example. There was electricity that was put in by private companies, at the end of the 19th century, in the early 20th century, and a few people like Edison had some ideas. But a good chunk of the country, there was no electrification. Why? Because it wasn't profitable. Because it didn't make sense to run electric grids into rural populations and smaller towns, and even outside of the main cities, because there wasn't enough population to account for it. So who built electricity in the United States? FDR. the rural electrification project. And we electrified 95% of the nation, and therefore agriculture grew in the United States to the most productive in the world. And we got people talking today about small government. You know, taxes and this. Well, what's going on? We're subsidizing a monetarist project. Now, let me give you an example of where we stand. Today, think of what today, the Chinese landed a rover on the moon. You know, we don't have any plans to do anything like that. There's talk about maybe going out to an asteroid. There's a reason to do certain things with the asteroids. But we don't have a major space project. It's down, down, down. And then people say, well, the Chinese are doing this and that. What? The Chinese are doing what any nation would want to do that has 1.4 billion people to feed. That has an idea of lifting its population out of poverty. Now, as Lyndon LaRouche, and I'll come back to a couple things, because I want to make, Lyndon LaRouche made the point. The real orientation of the country, of the United States, should be to the Pacific, across the Pacific. The Bering Straits, the Pacific, an alliance with the Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, and others, the Koreans and so forth, who have a sense Asia is on the rise, in a good sense. They want to lift their population up. They want scientific and technological development. They have to feed a population. If we're oriented to the transatlantic, to a monetarist, empire-dominated system, we're finished. And we're losing it. Look, we're rapidly falling off the charts. In one sense, the world would need the United States now, as LaRouche has called for, to join this kind of project, these kinds of agreements. We still have a certain capability, but we're rapidly losing it. The younger generation, the education of the youth now in high school, junior high school, into secondary school is terrible. They have no sense of what science is. There's a certain amount of computer work that's done, and that's about it. Look, where's most of American computer? You know what the highest, one of the, outside of the military, one area where there's a tremendous amount of use of supercomputers? Animation, Hollywood.
Yeah.
Talk about a waste. Now, I'll give you an example of where this is going to go. And then I want to come back to some of the things that LaRouche has said as the background. You know, I had the pleasure last week, just Monday, of visiting the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab in Princeton, New Jersey. Now, this lab has been there since, I think, 1951. Okay, and its main work is in plasma physics, which is an interesting area that itself has not been developed enough. But anyway, their main project is fusion energy. Now, LaRouche has called for the main science driver that we need for the kind of development that the Pacific calls for is fusion energy, because it's not just electricity. Fusion would actually change the nature of the economy. We would have a different conception of resources, because the energy density of fusion energy gives you the ability to not only electrify a great deal of the world in a much different way, but also changes your idea of what a resource is. Because you can now actually transmute elements. You have enough energy density to carry out what's called a fusion torch, magnetohydrodynamics, which runs on electricity, and the amount of energy you can deliver through a cross-section of area is much greater, which gives you the ability, for example, to break down elements or to separate isotopes out in an efficient way, and more, probably things we haven't discussed. It gives you enough power to generate high-powered lasers, and so on and so forth. It probably becomes the basis for not only exploration of the solar system, but defense against asteroids,
control of the asteroid belt, so on and so forth. And this kind of driver is what you need to lift the whole economy up. Now, at Princeton, the main thing they're working on, they have worked on, is the early tokamak reactor of the late 70s, mid to late 70s into the early 80s. Now, the tokamak, I'm not an expert on this, but the basic idea is it's a magnetic bottle. You generate a huge magnetic field in what looks like essentially a donut. And you run a plasma through it, which is an ionized gas. In other words, the electrons are stripped off. And you just have positive and negative charges floating around. And under those conditions, by increasing the bottle and the shape of the plasma, you create fusion. In other words, you take two hydrogen atoms and they collide enough, to be simple-minded about it, and they form a helium atom plus some neutrons. Okay? Now, in the course of this, for various reasons, the helium atom weighs less than the two hydrogen atoms. A certain amount of the mass is converted into energy. Now, if you know Einstein's famous equation, not necessarily the reasons for it, but energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Now, the speed of light is 186,000 miles a second. So when you square that, it's a big number. Roughly, it's 1.8 times 10 to the 6th times 10, so it's something 10 to the 12th, and then it's electron volts, and it's a lot. Okay? So if you convert just a little bit of the mass into energy, you get a huge amount of energy out of it. And the trick, so to speak, is to create something that holds together under difficult conditions. In other words, the way this works in the sun is basically, as far as we know, it may be more complicated, but at least it has elements of fusion energy in it. But the reason it works is because you got this massive ionized gas and a huge body, so the gravity pulls it together. And it's effectively the implosion of the gravity that causes the fusion to occur. Now, obviously, we don't have anything that big. This tells you also something about the human mind, because we have produced fusion, even though we haven't gotten net energy out of it. In the late 70s and early 80s, the Princeton tokamak produced fusion events. Now think about it. The human mind can create something by understanding the principles that work in the universe that only occurs in the way the human mind produces it. Because we understand the principles, we can produce fusion, let's say in something the size of this room or less. It takes the whole sun to produce the same operation. For example, some people believe that Jupiter is an object that could have become something like the sun, but it wasn't quite massive enough. Gives you an idea of the mass that you need. For example, many of the star systems in the galaxy that we know of are double star systems. It's not unusual to have a main star and then a star, they sort of orbit around each other, with one being bigger than the other. A lot of the systems that we found have large gaseous planets around them, we believe, that are near stars. So this gives you an idea of what it takes in nature, quote unquote, to create fusion. We're able to do that because we understand the principles, and we're very close to, in fact, to actual net production of energy through fusion and a fusion economy if we wanted to do it. If we thought this is where we should go. What's happened to the fusion program in the United States? Completely underfunded. You've got if you want to get on the LPAC website and look at a show that we did last Saturday, December the 7th, it's archived. We go through where the fusion program is. We don't have time to detail this here. But effectively, fusion is funded at a rate that will never get there. Okay, it's sort of like giving your kid $1,000 a year to go to college. And they'll never have enough money to go to college. but he's getting $1,000 a year to go to college. We put a little, $100 million a year into fusion, and everybody knows that's enough to do, not enough to do what we need to do. Now, we were on a track to fusion in the 1970s. We had something called the Fusion Energy Foundation that LaRouche pulled together that had some of the leading people in the country. And we were on a track that we knew was going to create fusion in different forms. And probably we would create fusion in successive forms. In other words, initially a tokamak, which is kind of a brute force approach. And then more knowledge about plasmas would lead us to create plasmas in a more efficient domain that would sustain fusion processes. Now, where are we today? Well, I'll tell you, we were at the plasma lab. They have one experiment, which is the main one that they're running, which has been delayed, which isn't up. It's a tokamak. We're also involved in the ITER project, which is an international project now based in France. It's got about 7 countries in it. The United States, Russia, Europe, Korea, I don't remember all of them, China, and so forth. And that's a project, right now they're expecting that project to be up and running by 2020. All of this is, a lot of problems with collaboration amongst the countries and so on and so forth. There maybe it's probably worth doing. But we've taken the money out of the US projects, and once we put the money into ITER, there's nothing left. Very small amount. Now, the punchline is, however, is much better. So when we were there, they also had a stellarator project. This is a somewhat different project to try to create a certain, this was the original project that was worked on in the 50s, to get something that, so to speak, just to put it, the geometry of the way the plasma flows holds the plasma together and creates within the plasma and the self-sustaining plasma, it creates certain kinds of singularities or densities that within which the fusion occurs. So it's a little bit more sophisticated. It's a self-sustaining plasma if it works. A lot of this is getting the impurities out, making sure that we don't get what they call magnetic reconnection and so forth. But this is another idea. Now, this idea was worked on in the 50s, then it didn't seem to work. Now we're working on it again. So this project was being worked on until about a year or two ago. Because the best way to do this is you don't do one experiment. For example, even in the Manhattan Project, which is a good example, it's the atom bomb. Whether we should have dropped it or not, we shouldn't have. But the idea of showing we had the ability was a different matter. Now, we produced an atomic bomb in 2 years. From scratch. Now, we had the advantage that a lot of the European scientists came over and worked with us on it. But it was done in the United States. This thing had enough. We had Los Alamos, we had Lawrence Livermore, we had Tennessee Oak Ridge. We didn't have one project. In fact, in Los Alamos itself, they built 2 different versions of the bomb. One was the U-235 and one was a plutonium version. They had different triggering mechanisms. Because we weren't going to work on this as one project, because in fact, we didn't know if that was going to work or not. You had a crash program. Now, but the wonderful thing about the stellarator is that the guy who was giving us the tour, really wanted fusion. He said, if we need international cooperation, we should do it. He's been working on it for 25 years. So he did show us the stellarator. And he says, this project, nothing is being done on it. How much short is it of money? About $100 to $150 million. For one of $100 to $150 million, we've shut that project down. It has 0 funding. This is true across the Alcatur in Massachusetts, which has reached some of the highest parameters of the so-called Lawson parameters of pressure, temperature, to get to a fusion. Shut down. They're keeping it open day by day at this point, no funding. San Diego, they've got a small tokamak experiment, shut down. Okay, so the Chinese, who have the 2 most advanced tokamak projects in the world functional right now are East in China and K-Star in Korea, in South Korea. So the Chinese offered the Princeton lab to buy the Stellarator and ship it to China. Now, the U.S. said no. The Princeton lab said no, because they wanted the Stellarator there, blah blah blah. So the Chinese then said, and this is as of last Monday, the Chinese then said, no, they said, we'll give you 30%. We'll invest 30% of what you need, and you can keep it. Just, it's worth it for us for you to work on it. We'll invest 30%. You have to get the other 70% from somewhere in the United States. Couldn't get it. Right, the guy actually said they're going to private industry to try to get it. They're not going to get it from private industry. It's not profitable enough. It's like our space program is now a private program. You got SpaceX and God knows what else. And these guys can barely get out of the atmosphere. And most of it was financed and subsidized by the government up until now, and still is. And these are the big questions. We're not going to have the capability. Now, how did the Chinese, yes, you can say this. One interesting thing, how did the Chinese get to the moon? Well, we shipped them the auto industry. We shipped them our machine tool capability because we were going to get cheap labor for Wall Street. That's the truth of the matter. Now, what do we have in Detroit? Detroit is bankrupt. The auto industry did what? They ran out. This is what LaRouche was commenting on this morning. That we have basically deindustrialized the Midwest, most especially the machine tool capability. Because look, you can't build these things without a machine tool capability. Do you realize what the relevant levels of tolerances in a space program versus something else? We're talking about tolerances for example, in the tokamak or the Stellarator of 2/1000ths, 2/10,000ths of an inch. I mean, you're talking about 2 sheets of paper tolerance. Now, there's only certain kinds of machine tools and certain kinds of precision equipment and engineers and technicians. Where's the scientific capability in the United States? Where's the engineering capability? We've outsourced the country, not just because we went for cheap labor. And what do the Chinese know now? The Chinese went along with the cheap labor program for a while because they thought, okay, we're going to export, we're going to get, balance of payments, we're going to have reserve currencies. But what have they realized in the last 5 years? The export markets are dying. Europe and the United States. Plus, we're developing cheaper labor in Europe and the United States. They can't compete as well. There's even cheaper labor in Bangladesh and Indonesia. There's more enslavement. And it is slavery. And so they realize they can't go with cheap labor. And so they're also realized if they don't do this soon, the money's worthless. They've got $3.5 trillion in reserves. About 60% is in dollars. And about 50% is in U.S. bonds. Now, clearly they're not interested in destroying the United States. If the United States blows out, they lose half of what they've got. So their point is they want to use it now. It's the old expression, use it or lose it. They want development. The Chinese have never been an expansionary power. There was all this hype about this air defense zone. Everybody's got an air defense zone. We have air defense zones. Off the west coast of the United States, off Alaska, we have an air defense identification zone. Off the east coast, we have an air defense identification zone. The Japanese have had an air defense identification zone since the 1960s. So China has an air defense identification zone, and there's a certain problem in it because there's overlaps. But the U.S. military, Welsh, who's the chief of the Air Force, General Welsh, said 2 days ago that, look, this may be better. It's a basis for us to talk to the Chinese and develop communication on military matters. Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, is against confrontation. Dempsey's conception is that the United States should not fall into what's called the Thucydides trap. Now, Thucydides was the Greek historian around the time of the Peloponnesian War. And he wrote a famous history. And his point partly was that the mistake that was made is to allow the conflict between the receding power and the rising power to come to the point of war. And Dempsey's point is the same thing. That we should not allow ourselves to become a receding power that's giving up its scientific and technological capability, its standard of living, and then see ourselves in conflict with the so-called rising power of China or Asia overall. Now, this is all in 2007, 2008, in a sequence of discussions. Lyndon LaRouche, July 25th, 2007, and then I'll make a point about a little bit later, forecast, and this is an extremely important point. There's a whole idea of forecasting. Forecast the blowout of the transatlantic financial system. And I refer to it that way because, look, the U.S. is intimately connected to London, Amsterdam, Frankfurt, the transatlantic financial system. This is largely the residue of what I'm referring to, what Lynn refers to as the Anglo-Dutch Empire. Now, people know mostly about the British Empire. It still exists. It may have taken a slightly different form. It's no longer a great naval power. Because what do they think? The U.S. will do the work. It was said explicitly by somebody like Cecil Rhodes, who, of course, was one of the great empire theoreticians, particularly with respect to Africa. And what did Rhodes say? Well, we need, British brains and American muscle. We've got the industry, we've got the population, but let's manipulate it so that they do our bidding. That was Churchill's view. Look, what happened with World War II? The British created World War II. They were behind the Versailles Treaty. They funded Hitler, along with some Americans, like Prescott Bush. Hitler in 1932 was near suicide, and they owed a ton of money. He was badly in debt before then, and in German law at the time, you can go to jail for debt. So in late 32 and early 33, Schroeder's Bank, Prescott Bush, Brown Brothers Harriman, financed the Nazi Party. In Christmas of 32, Hitler wrote to, it was either Goebbels or Himmler, and said, I'm on the verge of suicide. He was resurrected by Anglo-Dutch finance, Anglo-American at the time, but Wall Street is largely London. And where did the British come from? That's the story. The Dutch basically took over Great Britain, or England, in the late 17th century. So what we know is the British, the House of Windsor is basically the House of Hanover. Prince Philip, is from a Greek German royal family. Lord Mountbatten the family name is Battenberg. Mountbatten. So this is what came over. And under William of Orange, this is what took over the British in the late 17th century. And the empire developed from that point on. And largely today, it's a financial empire. And it runs a good deal of the world. Now, you ask yourself an interesting question. Why is it we can afford what does a dollar mean if you can take trillions of dollars to bail out the banks and you don't have $100 million for the Stellarator or for a space program or for more advanced industrial development? It means there's something screwy. It's not just that you're spending money. It's not as though you've really got $1 trillion that represents something and you're giving it to the banks. At least then you can say to the banks, well, what are you going to do with the money? You're going to get some... No, we have no expansion in the industrial base, no expansion in science, no expansion in energy production. There's nothing behind the money. But that money, since we recognize it as having some value, demands something out of the real economy upon which to base this pyramid. And so the more debt is rolled over based on these trillions of dollars, the more they demand cuts in the real economy that represent supposedly money going into the bubble. And people believe the craziest things. Because we find it easy to not think sometimes. Take this bubble. Lynn said this bubble is going to blow. It wasn't just the mortgage back. We got bubbles in everything. The big one was mortgages, but that was because they created mortgage-backed securities. And people say it's Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. No, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac was the last place that the banks dumped their mortgage-backed securities. It was effectively a federal guarantee. These banks had complete there's no guarantees on everything that they did. And Lynn said this is what's going to happen. Of course, in the spring, Stearns went under, Lehman Brothers went under. Now, I have to go off on one of my favorite jags on this, because I saw this, I was in LA a lot of the time. In LA, along with San Francisco and Massachusetts were the big areas of the bubble. New York, it wasn't really a nationwide bubble. It was located in some very small places. Now, in LA, one of the stories was, this was the banks were being fooled by these poor immigrants and so forth and so on. And they had a story in the LA Times about some family of Mexican immigrants who were doing, lawn cleaning. I think it was about 8 people in the family. And they had a mortgage for $700,000. And the guy at the bank wanted to say, well, yeah, they did it. I said, come on, these people barely knew English. And the bank got fooled by them? The poor bank was outmaneuvered and outflipped and by a bunch of slick immigrants who didn't even know English? So, what was the point? The banks wanted to do this. They created the subprime mortgage. Now we got the student bubble. By the way, people are talking about the automobiles. Supposedly we're having the best year in automobile sales since 2007. There's a subprime market in automobiles. They're doing the same thing again. And they'll continue to do it. Now, in 2008, before anybody else brought this up, in 2008, after the whole thing began to blow out completely, LaRouche put forward Glass-Steagall. In the fall of 2008. The first bill was put forward in 2010 by Cantwell, McCain, and so on. Capter put forward a bill last year. Now there's 4 bills on Glass-Steagall. The Capter bill, there was just a bill introduced by Tierney and Jones a couple of days ago in the House. There's the Warren, McCain, King, Cantwell bill in the Senate, and there's the Harkin bill in the Senate. And there's basically 2 pairs of complementary bills. But Lynn put this forward in 2008. I know this because it so happened I was asked at that time to do a 10-minute video on Glass-Steagall, because Lynn mentioned it at a meeting, and then we wanted to get something out. So we got something out that went out then, and there's been a lot more since then. Well, what was Glass-Steagall? Glass-Steagall is a somewhat defensive step. It's just the opening step. If you leave it at Glass-Steagall, you really haven't changed anything, but you have to do Glass-Steagall or you can't change anything. It's what Leibniz calls a necessary but not sufficient condition. In other words, without Glass-Steagall, you can't move. But if you think it's Glass-Steagall is enough, you made a mistake. You got to follow Glass-Steagall up with an actual development policy based on a credit system. And that's a system where you've got federal projects, large-scale federal projects, that are initially funded by federal credit. And once that gets the large projects going, then the local banks and the regional banks can generate further credit, which is used to bring the private entrepreneurs into the project. And that's where you get real creativity. Because what happens is, as they bid to take on the projects, and as they solve the problems in the projects, then you get advances in productivity, both by the completion of the project itself, because these are projects that are always universal projects. They cover whole areas that no single company or even necessarily a single state is going to cover, like the TVA or the water management. And then you look at what comes out of this, it's not really just spin-offs. You take the space program, virtually everything we have that we call modern technology, that we think is what we've done, comes from either the military or the space project. Computers. Everybody's fascinated. We've got the cell phone, we've got the iPhone, this phone, that phone. You know, pretty soon you're going to have a computer in your brain chip or something. Who knows? Okay? All right? But what is this? These all came off the space project. How many people know where the mouse came from? Everybody, how many, I know it's a little older audience maybe, I know I'm not that great with computers, but where did the mouse come from? It came from the Strategic Air Command. In the early 1950s, they were trying to track all the aircraft going over the United States. Because you had military aircraft and you had commercial aircraft. And there was a lot of them, even then, in 53, 54. Imagine what it's like today. So they had transponder numbers to identify the aircraft. And so what they would do is they had a stick, an electronic stick, that when they would hit one of the, they would point at one of the radar signals of an aircraft, and it would have a transponder number that you would get off of it. That was what was used to get to the mouse. The mouse is essentially a stick that you point at one of these things that has an identification on it, a code on it. Virtually everything you've got came from this. Miniaturization came from the building of strategic missiles because they wanted to get the components smaller and smaller, the guidance system smaller and smaller. And one advantage we had over the Soviets were building big rockets with big payloads. We were building smaller rockets with smaller payloads, but more accurate guidance systems and so on and so forth. That's the truth of the matter. And what did you get? What created creativity is people would come together, they'd have a project, particularly the space project, and they'd have to figure out ways to build the thing better. This meant certain kinds of engineering and scientific breakthroughs. For example, one of the big problems in space travel is the ratio of fuel to payload. In liquid rockets, for example, you need huge amounts of fuel, chemical rockets, huge amounts of fuel to get a little bit of a payload. That's why the Saturn V is so big. So obviously part of what you're doing, first of all, is you're trying to find how to reduce the weight of the payload. And ultimately, you're trying to figure out how to make the fuel more efficient. To make it finally more efficient, you got to move from chemical to atomic. A new kind of chemistry. As Lynn said, it's the table of chemistry keeps changing. What we deal with. This is real science. Creativity, the human mind. And so we put forward Glass-Steagall. And we've been fighting for Glass-Steagall for 5 years. Now, that's not, a lot of people get frustrated easily. 5 years isn't that long. Historically, it's a blip on the screen. Even in the history of the United States, which is a relatively young country, 5 years isn't much out of 235. So you can't, if you don't have enough concentration politically to work on something for 5 years, you're not going to get very far. Now what's happened? We now have the fruition of the Obama 5 years. Bush did the same thing. Bush was bailing out the banks, et cetera, et cetera. Obama is worse. Because Obama, first of all, has a worse personality. He's not just stupid. Bush was the kind of president, give him a football game and a beer and you'd be happy. Obama, he's a basketball player, but he's also got, Obama, as I said, comes out of the Chicago school. This is the idea of behavior, that you can change people's choices, apparently democratically, by changing their behavior. And that's part of what Obamacare is. The idea is you have to go to the insurance company, this is an incentive for doing this is an incentive for doing that. You get less deductibles but less coverage. You're young, all this stuff. They're trying to get young people to buy in. It's all a fraud. It's all meant to pump money into the insurance companies, which are now tied into Wall Street. Remember, part of overthrowing Glass-Steagall was banks can be insurance companies, investment houses, et cetera, brokers. Now, what did they do? They implemented Dodd-Frank and then the Volcker Rule. Some of you may have heard this in the last week or so. Now, what's the Volcker Rule? It's a fraud. The Volcker Rule doesn't change anything. The Volcker Rule says banks can't trade for their own profit. And supposedly this keeps them out of speculation. It doesn't. It says that they can trade to hedge risk. They can trade on a customer account to get enough stock to back it up. Now, how are you supposed to tell whether they're trading on the customer's account or their own account? How can you tell when they're hedging risk or trying to make a profit? It's not loopholes. These are tunnels. You can drive a Mack truck through it. Or as one guy said, actually, Kaufman, who was the senator from Delaware, said they just produced the biggest bunch of Swiss cheese in all history. It's a complete fraud. Now, what this has done usefully is it's raised the issue of Glass-Steagall. In fact, the same day that the Volcker Rule was rammed through by the Obama administration, Tierney and Jones put forward a new Glass-Steagall bill. Now, if we mobilize ourselves, we can get Glass-Steagall. Now, I'm not talking about just one of these, complaining. Typically, the problem with the American system, American people, is that they want to complain, but we can't do anything about it. Cynicism, pessimism is, largely the opportunist way out. Actually, I'll quote a guy, nonetheless, who deserves quoting on this. Lenin. Lenin once said, pessimism is nothing but the opportunism of defeatism. Because the pessimist says, I don't have to do anything since it'll never work. It's a coward's way out. Now, you don't have to like Lenin to appreciate that he was right on that point. And that's what we're dealing with. Now, LaRouche made it very clear in 2009, before anybody understood, because it's not just a complaint about Obama did this and Obama did that. Most presidents have done bad things. But what Lynn said in April of 2009, in a international webcast, this wasn't behind closed doors, he said, Obama has a peculiar kind of personality defect. He's a narcissist. He loves himself more than anything else. He goes to the Mandela funeral and he talks about Obama. And he takes selfies, right?
Yeah. Selfies.
Okay? he tries to explain to people that he lied to them about Obamacare, but he really meant well. And they should all trust him. So he's got a peculiar defect, which is dangerous, because it's the kind of thing where if things don't go his way, he blows up. Now, one of the things we face, and we have to face in this, because yes, if we orient to the Pacific, if we orient to Asia, if we orient to what the United States really saw as its destiny to begin with, you know, John Quincy Adams talked about the development of a continental nation oriented to the Pacific. Lincoln, oriented to the Pacific. McKinley, Douglas MacArthur, FDR, Kennedy. This was the vision of the United States sort of coming in the back door, because Europe came here to get away from the European oligarchy. And we have that opportunity. But at the same time, if we don't do it, what we're seeing, and people should be clear, what we're seeing right now, if we don't do it, we're on the verge of something that people haven't thought about for a long time, maybe a little bit since the 50th anniversary of Kennedy's assassination. We're looking at thermonuclear war. And too many people think, no, that's 1960s stuff, 1970s. It all ended when the Soviet Union disappeared. Forget it, that's not the case. I have a friend, an interesting case, who just wrote me something not too long ago. He had joined the Navy, and he was in boot camp. So he sent a letter which got to me 6 weeks later. I don't know what boot camp was like, but anyway. In the letter, he said, you know, we're sort of out of touch. They don't let us keep on top of current events, so to speak. But the one thing they did draw them in for is they brought them in and they told them, look, we may be at war with Syria. Now, for them to tell people in boot camp, because this was during boot camp, that you guys may be called up on or we may be dealing with the Syrian war, that should give you an idea of how close we were to war, not that long ago. Now, what did that mean? Who's backing the Syrians? Iran, Russia. They don't want, they've seen, now we've got our own people. Michael Hayden, the former head of the CIA, just said 2 days ago that maybe it's time to face the fact that the best solution in Syria might be for Assad to stay in. Why? Because we've been backing jihadis. We've backed Al-Qaeda. The greatest part of the opposition, the fighting opposition in Syria, is Al-Qaeda. The same thing we did in Libya. This is Obama's policy. Now, what's going on in Ukraine? We've got members of the State Department in the Independence Square supporting the opposition. Now, you don't do that. As one of our members pointed out in a question and answer period with the State Department at a briefing, what would happen if, Medvedev or Putin would come over to, Capitol Hill and demonstrate for the impeachment of Obama? What would the State Department say? I mean, this is not a question of being soft. This is, you don't interfere in the internal affairs in that way of another nation. And if we think the president can do this, this is a long story in American history. Lincoln, what did Lincoln say in the case of the Mexican War? He said, if we allow the president to declare war based on an expected attack, then we've turned the president into a monarch. That's what we supposedly said we didn't want to have happen. You can't allow that, and this is what they're asking for. This is the Führer principle. This is the Carl Schmitt principle. Now, Lynn forecast the nature of this presidency. We also, identify not just what people have said about Obamacare. Obamacare is bad. I said it bails out the insurance companies. It's bad. But it's worse. Obamacare is really modeled on the Nazi policy of the late 1930s and early 1940s. It's a death policy. Okay? It's a policy that says if you're too sick and too old, perhaps it's not. One of the ways, we're not even saying that we're not going to cover that, but let's look at what we're going to do with Medicare. We're going to have to cut it back to meet the budget requirements. This is why anybody that says Obama's a socialist, forget it. The guy works for the Anglo-Dutch financial system. So what's the idea? We're not going to increase what we do. We're not going to have fusion energy. We're not going to have expanded development. We're going to have a shrinking reality. So now we can't afford to keep you alive, you should recognize. If you get terminally ill at the age of 60, you probably don't have much quality of life left. We shouldn't expend as much. We'll save money that way. How will we do it? We'll reduce the payments to the health providers. So the doctors are going to drop out of Medicare. So you have more doctors and so on. Then once you're through Medicare, what do you do with regular insurance? You have $5,000 deductibles. Well, maybe you can't afford the expensive care. We're not going to pay for expensive treatments for chronic ailments. And so to me, you have a Nazi policy without the stormtroopers. Accountants can be killers. Remember, Eichmann was an accountant. All Eichmann ever did was keep track of the people they were killing. He never killed a single person. He never pulled the trigger on anybody. That's the way most of the killing got done. And I think we lose track of what this means. A lot of people never understood the situation with the Russians, even to this day. Because I don't think people understand what happened, for example, in this Ukraine situation makes the point. Because if we decide that we're going to intervene in Ukraine, to bring Ukraine into the orbit of a dying system in Europe, as against Russia, the Russians will properly see this as a threat to the existence of Russia. Which means we're going to end up in a confrontation with Russia. And the powers that be, London and Wall Street, to protect their system, they're prepared to go to confrontation. They may have the illusion that the Russians and the Chinese are going to back down. But they're not. Dmitry Rogozin, the vice prime minister, made it very clear that the Russians will use nuclear response if that's the choice that they're given. Now, I'll give you an example. The American military has been, or think tanks, have come up with a new strategic doctrine called prompt strategic response. Now, what is this? Supposedly, we're going to load up strategic missiles with conventional weapons. In other words, instead of nuclear arms, it's going to be ICBMs, or intermediate range, with conventional warheads. Now, the idea is these are going to be precision-crafted missiles with shaped and precision warheads, which are going to be able to knock out enemy positions, including enemy missiles. And part of the idea clearly is not only the precision strike, but if we use conventional weapons, then they can't use nuclear weapons. So there's the rules of the game. Okay? Now, obviously, what Rogozin is saying is we're going to use nuclear weapons. If that's all we get, if you have a conventional superiority over us and you're going to use it, then we're going to use the only weapon we have. And the Chinese have. Now, the Russians are clearly a different order of magnitude. Now, why do we want that when the Russians can't afford confrontation with us? They're trying to build up their economy. If we play games, and people have to understand the history of this, Ukraine is the grain field of the Russian population. in trade. It's the black earth of Ukraine is famous. In fact, Stalin did some bad things with it, but that's the reality of the situation. Ukraine was one of the major industrial centers of the Soviet Union and still is one of the major industrial areas of that part of the world. It's got 50 million people, not 6 million people or 8 million people. It's a major country that borders on Russia, as does Poland and Belarus and so on and so forth. Now, what happened in World War II? Hitler wanted Ukraine, and he wanted the North Caucasus for oil and for agriculture. Now, how many people, what people don't really understand, what happened in World War II? Some of you may remember, or may have read about it. But here's where you get why people don't understand the imbalance. The Russians, the Soviets, including some, lost 27 million people in World War II. And that might be a relatively conservative count. The Americans, how many deaths did the U.S. have in World War II?
Less than 1 million.
400,000. Now, that's not a small number, but it ain't 27 million. How many did the British lose in World War II? 400,000. And we had about 1 million casualties. The Russians had 27 million dead. I don't know how many casualties. So if Western Europe, in its dying phase, Greece is impoverished. They have 27% unemployment by official figures. I won't even go into all the other figures. Spain has 60% youth unemployment. Portugal, similar figure. Italy is blowing out. Now, actually, there is some motion toward Glass-Steagall in the Italian parliament, in Belgium. Of course, Belgium is give you a sense, and the next point I want to get into is to give you a sense of what Lynn talks about in terms of a dark age in Western civilization. Because one of the things that's going on alongside of this whole medical, which is not exactly euthanasia. You go to the medical ideas, you can't afford it, we can't afford you, it's too expensive. But of course, in some places, we have the rise of euthanasia. Now, what is this? What is this? What the Nazi policy was, beginning in '39. I mean, there were things before, but most of what was before was slave labor, concentration camps. Slave labor, they were associated with Krupp plants and Thyssen plants and Farben plants, and this was cheap labor in the form of slave labor. It's worth knowing, that the first use of the word concentration camps did not come in Germany. It came in South Africa. And it was the Boers, the Dutch, who were enslaved by the empire because the Boers rebelled against the British control at the time, and they had left Holland and so on and so forth. So, but then you had slave labor camps in Germany in the 30s. In 39, they introduced this Tier 4, the Tierstrasse 4, which was number 4 Tier Street. But it was the headquarters of their medical program. And the medical program said that people whose lives are not worth living, the irreparably ill or disabled, the mentally, Germans, were to be terminated. And about 260,000 Germans were killed under this program. Wow. This also was one of the famous experiments that you may have heard about. That became the policy in the concentration camps. If you couldn't work, if you weren't up to snuff, first they let you die, then they killed you. And the policy went on. Now, what do we have with Obamacare has the death policy. On top of that, which means, if you're 65 years old, what's your quality of life if you have something really seriously wrong? Take it easy. We have hospice cares for you. Don't worry about it. We'll give you enough morphine that you'll barely know what's going on.
Is that true?
Okay? Now, and then you have the euthanasia policy. Now, one of the most extreme forms of this, in Holland, they passed a law a few years ago that you can ask to be euthanized. And they'll have to help you. In Belgium, where they've also had a euthanasia policy, the day before yesterday, so we're talking about now, the Belgian Senate passed legislation 50-17 that children above the age of 12 can be asked to be euthanized.
If they have a terminal illness.
If they have a terminal illness, right? Not just because they're handicapped at this point, so far. Okay? Now, of course, this leaves open a very broad question, because if people ask, what's a terminal illness? Particularly when you deal with children, because there's certain recovery capabilities that children have that are a little different. You know, it's not the same biology. So what's happened? How do we view human beings? Because ultimately, the question of value is not money. Money doesn't mean anything. Money has a certain secondary role. Particularly in a more sophisticated economy, you've got a division of labor, you have a time cycle, and in order to bring these into some exchangeability, in a credit system, you issue paper money. You don't need coin. It's not a question of the value of the coin. It's the paper money that represents the credit and the orientation of the system. And if you do that, you have a chance for actual development. Now, what LaRouche has been, one of the things we need to do, for example, look, mankind does have a mission. We just don't exactly know all the nuances of it. We're not trapped, we're not a physical, simply a physical being. And this gets into some, some important areas. But it's clearly embedded. I gave you one idea of the preamble. The other idea that's often lost is what's the purpose of the Union? For us and our posterity. In other words, we're not a nation that exists simply for the present moment, nor are we a nation that exists to reproduce an aristocracy. In effect, if you look at an oligarchic society, why does that society exist? It doesn't exist to reproduce the population. It exists to reproduce the oligarchy. And the oligarchy reproduces itself by reproducing its property, its wealth, in this form of landed property or financial property. In some ways, the split in the oligarchy is between the landed and the financial. Sometimes they don't always work together. And that's what society, why do the serfs exist? To reproduce the oligarchy. Why do slaves exist? To reproduce the oligarchy. Why does cheap labor exist? To reproduce the oligarchy. Now, why does the United States exist? For us and our posterity. We, the people of the United States. We exist to reproduce the future, or to produce the future. And in fact, we have to produce a future that's good enough that when we leave that future behind, that future has a future. That's really why we do what we do. The reason we have a better standard of living is because if we have a better standard of living, we're better situated to reproduce that future. The productivity of labor is greater. The development of other human minds is more important. The creativity of children. We don't have to worry. We don't just care about our own children. We're not animals. Now let me make the point that Lynn has made most recently. We are not animals. Not only aren't we animals, but we're not of the same substance as animals are. We live in a biological organism. And we use that biological organism. But that's not who we are. Animals reproduce themselves biologically. Ultimately, you can reduce what an animal does to simple biological reproduction. Maybe, different theories of evolutionary development. Most of the theories aren't too good, but there is evolution. And animals develop by maintaining their DNA. They literally are driven to reproduce their DNA. Human beings don't reproduce themselves that way. We reproduce society as a whole. We reproduce not our children, though we may have a special role in that, but we reproduce the children of society. They are the future. And a society that doesn't care for any part of its children doesn't care about the future. It's not just about us in the sense of individuals. Because it does. Look at this room. There's nothing in this room that isn't artificial. Look at the grass out there. Completely artificial. We probably nursed it, grew it. It may not have been like that before. What are the trees around us? Most of them are trees that we reproduced. Human beings, that's how we live. Human beings evolve by using their mind to know more about nature, which allows us to reproduce human existence at increasing levels of development, increasing standards of living, increasing numbers of people. Because the more people you have, the greater potential for creativity. But it's even more precise than that. Because frankly, as you lift the standard of living of a population, it takes more people to reproduce a person. Your children have a kind of population density that runs through them. Because 100 years ago, how many doctors did it take to produce a child who could function in society? Usually they were working by the time they were 11, 12, 13. The average lifespan was 40 or 50. And you didn't think, well, they have to live to be 70 or 80 because of the potential productivity. So you didn't have doctors and nurses per child. You didn't have schools that had laboratories and it should have had teachers and so on and so forth. You didn't have schools for every child. So what you find is producing an individual in society as it advances requires more people to sustain and develop that life. If we were all just living off the grid somewhere in Idaho, there wouldn't be that many of us. And frankly, we probably wouldn't have made it because, physically we're not that impressive. Okay? I mean, and everything you think you can use, bows and arrows, stone tool weapons, we wouldn't last all that long. We could be chasing antelopes in the African desert somewhere. There are people who do that successfully. Okay? But physically, there's not that much. It's the mental development. It's the creativity of the human mind. And then what you realize, and I'm not talking about a spiritual substance. It's literally the human mind, the ability to create new forms of human activity, to discover laws, to discover physical principles. And those ideas live beyond you. Those ideas which you help to communicate or develop in children, you've partaken in that. That's your immortality. If there's some place where people go and they meet God and God tells them all these things, fine. But I don't think he would have put you here if he didn't have anything for you to do, except to get there.
Hallelujah.
All right? So if people have a mission in this world. And this is the power of being human. We're not animals. We're completely different, ontologically different. The way we live is different. Our identity is different. And in the literal sense, because when you're alive, the part of your humanity is that you think about what you're going to be able to do for the good of future generations. And indeed, the idea, and Lynn has hit this idea, that we can't know what the future is going to be. Now, we can't predict in the sense of saying, that it's going to rain tomorrow. That's maybe we're going to do that once in a while. We're not going to predict what things are going to look like in some literal sense. What we're saying is, what's the direction that humanity has to take? What are the discoveries that we have to make? What does the development of the population have to look like? Where are we going to have to be? And then you look at this and you realize, what do you have to know to do that? And you get even take the case of asteroids. The likelihood that we'll get hit by something eventually is pretty high. It could be a year from now, it could be 100,000 years from now. But the planet has been bombarded periodically with asteroids. In the Yucatan Peninsula, in Tunguska in Siberia, and then we had this case last February, which was a case, Chelyabinsk. If that thing had come in at a different angle, slightly different trajectory, a city could have been wiped out. Big enough, you can wipe out a continent. Big enough, maybe you can blow everything out. Now, if we begin to discover what the asteroid belt is like, particularly the ones that circulate between Mars and Earth, we discover certain things about the way the solar system works at a deeper level than we even know now. We begin to develop the power required to get out there and explore that area. If we put proper equipment on the moon and Mars, doesn't mean we have to land there personally. But we put curiosity, or like what the Chinese did on the moon. We begin to monitor in intensive ways this area, we can defend ourselves. At the same time, we will increase the power of humanity in the solar system. And where is the solar system going? Remember, the whole universe has developed. That's a whole other story. The universe is not entropic. It's not headed toward a death. And in part, we represent that, because we're not entropic. Now, I'll give you a sense of how much this is a cultural battle. Because this is not just, this is really, when it comes to economic value, what is it? It's Adam Smith, pleasure and pain. We're just a bunch of animals. We have pleasures. In fact, we're better off if we don't think too much. Thinking tends to screw up the economy. If you think about the future and you want to direct the future and you want this kind of progress and that kind of development, you're likely to mess everything up. The government is always messing everything up. So we're going to mess everything up. The better thing is to don't think, just feel like if you like that movie, go to that movie, then people will pay for that movie, and whoever did that movie will get more money, and they'll invest in more movies, and you'll probably like that too. Okay? And if the movie is bad, you won't go and they'll go broke, and so on and so forth. If you like this kind of magazine, this kind of food, if you're going to be cautious, then you're just letting your feelings run, as Adam Smith said, and the invisible hand will steal the money out of your pocket. Okay? They'll make the money off of it, and that money will make the world go around. And somehow it might lead in a good direction. So you're better off remaining an animal or a machine. Now, I'll give you an idea of how crazy this is, but I actually take this stuff in a certain way seriously. And I don't know about Lynn exactly right, but there's an article in the New York Times from last Monday, Considering the Humanity of Non-Humans. That's the title. What is a person? Beings who recognize themselves as I's. Like the letter I. Those are persons. And suppose, this is from a philosophy professor at Wesleyan University, who thinks and writes about non-human animals and the moral and philosophical issues involved in how we treat them. She was responding to questions in an interview last week after advocates used a new legal strategy to have chimpanzees recognized as legal persons with the right to liberty, albeit a liberty within considerable limits. The Non-Human Rights Project An advocacy group led by Stephen M. Wise filed writs of habeas corpus in New York last week on behalf of our 4 captive chimpanzees. Tommy at Gloversville, 2 of them at Stony Brook, and 1 in Niagara Falls. The lawsuits were dismissed, but Mr. Wise said he planned to appeal. He believes that the historical use of habeas corpus lawsuits as a tool against human slavery offers a model for how to fight for legal rights for non-humans. And then they go through, Mr. Wise argues that chimps are enough like humans that they should have legal rights. Not the right to vote or freedom of religion. I'm not aiming for a full-blown Planet of the Apes. This is serious. I'm not making this up. But a limited right to bodily liberty. The suits ask that the chimpanzees be free to go to sanctuaries where they would have more freedom. This is the one that says it might happen in some future life. The kind of science that supports the idea of chimpanzees as autonomous could also support the idea that many other animals fit the bill. These are affidavits related to cognitive ability, tool use, social life, and many other capabilities of chimpanzees. But there are questions about how pertinent, and they're talking about chimps, elephants, and cetaceans, which are whales. So we may be joined by a whole density of whatever here.
That was the Wall Street Journal.
Huh?
That was the Wall Street Journal.
No, the New York Times.
Oh, New York Times.
Monday.
Does it say anything in there about health care for them?
They're gonna come
Right.
to the population.
Oh my, yeah.
Add more creatures to the population.
Anyway, they're self-aware and autonomous. They think of the future. Some birds hide seas to recover and leave anything. You can go on. This is not the future. This is ridiculous. But it's serious. Because actually what it's meant to do is not, part of it, yes. On the one hand, you have certain things, you want to treat animals with some decency, fine. You have the ASPCA, you have maybe other groups, then you have crazy groups, that's another story. But, PETA, they're lunatics. But anyway, if you want to be decent, fine. But are they really that worried? I don't think so. The whole idea is to make you think you're an animal. It's actually, the psychology is the opposite. They're saying, human beings, see, let's look at animals. They look in a mirror, some of them, they might recognize themselves. They use, they bash open nuts with a stone, they're stone tool users. And it goes, ravens drop stones on eggs, so that makes them intelligent. A bird brain is about, they're bizarrely, they have a certain kind of intelligence, fine, they want to stay alive. Life is interesting in a certain sense, but the whole idea is you're an animal. Recognize everything you think is unique about humans, we can approximate with animals. So maybe we should treat them like they're almost human. And you can get closer and closer and closer. Look, this is a whole methodology, which is a whole other story. A lot of what we think is reduced to the little parts that make us up. Look, you could take all the chemicals and all of this, you don't get a human being, you don't get life out of it. There's something else that's life, that in some ways we haven't figured out yet. It's not mysterious, it's just something that we have to begin to understand what makes something alive as opposed to dead. Ask yourself, what's the difference in a human being? In that moment between life and death. So there's something to begin to understand. We can do that, we're human. Animals aren't going to even ask that question. Okay? We're human. We have the ability to discern universal principles that shape the future. We don't just know the future, we change the future. And therefore that changed future is the cause that we operate by. We have a whole different existence. And in many ways, and that's the way to look at this, is where is human creativity most reflected? And this gives you an idea how far we've come. In classical art. in classical composition, in drama, in the plastic arts, in music. And since that's the area where we can express the universal creativity of human beings, if that area gets degraded or separated out from science, which it never is, most of the great scientists were imbued with classical art. And there's famous stories that Einstein, Planck, where, Planck was a concert pianist. In fact, he almost became a concert pianist. He was just a little short of what he thought the necessary capability. Einstein was sort of a semi-professional violinist. But there are others. Kepler was imbued with music. Bach's music was partly based on Kepler. Drama, Shakespeare. Look, the greatest source of Lincoln's comprehension was, in some ways, the King James Version of the Bible, even though he wasn't a religious guy, and Shakespeare. Because Shakespeare is precisely about human history. What is Shakespeare? It's largely matters of state and matters of the human mind.
Yeah, social.
A lot of what was tragic was because things were tragic. It was an oligarchic society. So if some guy who was the king went nuts, the civilization was destroyed. And the civilization went along with it. They had the same values. Hamlet was largely a nut. He was a tragic thing. He was a nut. He was driven insane by the situation with his mother and his father, his uncle. Sure, there are elements, but basically he completely ignored his role as a leader of the society. But that's what the society wanted him to do. Macbeth was a killer. Although Macbeth, at least, I wouldn't say he had remorse, but it screwed him up. Then you have Richard III, it didn't screw him up that much. He was a truly nasty guy. But this is the arbitrariness of a monarchy. So this is what Lincoln looked at. What do you have to do? What do you face? And the truth of the matter is, if we didn't have Lincoln in the Civil War, we wouldn't be here. It's not as though we'd be a slave society. There's no way we would have survived. The British plan for the United States was to divide us up into 5 or 6 different parts. The western part of the United States, the Northwest, and there's still plans to do that. If they have the opportunity. More likely we'll end up in some kind of insane nuclear war. Or we'll change the situation. We'll implement Glass-Steagall. We'll implement an orientation toward the Pacific, a fusion economy, and we're going to have to do that by doing that the people in this room. And you can't say, well, what are the other guys going to do? I don't know. And it's not a question of barking orders at people. That's not leadership. Leadership is you have to say, here's what we need done, here's what I'm willing to do. And I must say, California used to be known for being the frontier of the United States. Aerospace, space, immigrants, the Pacific. Now it's sort of, certainly from the view from Southern California, it's increasingly a degenerate culture. That doesn't mean it's over, but it means we have to change something. The United States, we have the ability to change this. We don't simply look at Detroit. They just ruled, they had 2 rulings in Detroit. One is the judge ruled on the bankruptcy that it was legitimate. And then he also ruled that they don't have to, that the pensions which under the Michigan State Constitution are inviolate. The federal judge ruled, no, they're violable. We don't have to pay the pensions. Then they had a second ruling on the Delphi. The 30,000 Delphi workers were suing for their pensions because they had a contract with General Motors back in, 2007, or I forget now. Meanwhile, of course, General Motors went bankrupt and then were reorganized. So the judge ruled that the new General Motors does not have to pay the pensions because since they went through the bankruptcy, they're a different company.
Oh.
Reorganization.
Oh, this is the whole way they're reading the bankruptcy law. But this is how we're going to destroy the United States. But the main thing we've lost, and it is something we lost, because, nothing was perfect. So, but, I was born, I was 13 when Kennedy was elected, okay? And 16 when he was assassinated. And I remember the difference between, and there were problems before, big problems. The McCarthy period, the Truman period, the security state really began in 47. But there was a battle. Eisenhower was kind of in between, Kennedy was doing certain things. But once Kennedy went, and then it was followed by King and Kennedy, the country became cynical. There's no positive orientation. Everything that comes up, we can't build it. We took down the space program, the shuttle, we went through a little bit, but we let that go. We don't have nuclear plants, we're going to be a nuclear economy. We had 100 nuclear plants by the middle 1970s. We still have 100 nuclear plants. The fusion program was killed in the 1970s. We stopped the whole idea we can do these things. Why did Roosevelt think he could deal with Stalin? Because he was going to do it under the conditions of developmental progress that was the possible peace orientation toward the Soviets. It's not a question of whether Stalin was a good guy or not. But if you're pessimistic, if you don't think there's going to be development, if you're not going to contribute to development, what do you have to offer people in negotiation? Nothing. So we become cynical, we become defensive, and we become culturally a mess. And the drug, sex counterculture. I mean, forget it. It's true. I saw it. It happened. Sure, there are examples of better kids and so forth, but almost all of them feel that they have to give in. They may not take drugs, but you can't really legislate against them. I mean, if these people want, that's okay if they destroy their mind. What can you say? Rock music, people can defend it all they want. It's mind deadening. Just go into one of these things. Free sex. Look, we have commercials now that used to be called pornography. It's true. You turn on the television, I'm shocked. I don't even. But you turn on, and there's a commercial. It's sort of soft porn is evening commercials. What does that say about human beings?
Standards.
Well, it basically says you're a piece of meat.
Right.
You're two things that go bump in the night. And people can't think in that state of mind. You can't take a 14-year-old, a 15-year-old, and show them pornography and give them drugs and tell them to think. All right? So, and I think the real point, perhaps, is we have now the situation, the reason we have the two Glass-Steagall bills is because the hypocrisy. In effect, what's happened, Dodd-Frank, Obamacare, they've all come to roost now. 4 years ago, people opposed it. Then they gave up. Now it's happening. The Volcker Rule is happening. The banking system has been saved by slaughtering the American population and threatening worse for the world. And we have a chance to turn that around. Because Glass-Steagall, we got to say, wipe out Wall Street. Too many people worry, well, what about my money in Wall Street? First of all, don't worry about your money. What about your future? What about the future of the nation? Secondly, you're probably not going to keep it anyway. Remember what happened in 2007, 2008? I wouldn't bet a whole lot of money that you're going to have any money. So you have to decide what you want out of life. You want to leave behind a future? You want scientific development? Or you want enough money to lose that you can be unhappy that you lost it? So I'll leave it at that. We have time. All right? You want?
I just think we can open up the
Yeah.
floor for questions and discussion for people,
Yeah.
whatever's on their minds.
Oh, I just wanted to make a comment. There were right in the 70s, famous Harvard psychologists of the 50s, and I think Obama, B.F. Skinner,
Yeah.
Beyond Freedom and Dignity, that whole controlled, top-down reward system. And I know I'm a teacher, and that's what it's all based on reward, behavioral conditioning. And I think that, that's exactly what's being dumped on us, is that.
Well, let me make one point
Yeah.
on that. Some of this it's worth knowing how much of this is controlled and manipulated. The guy who was the original behaviorist, at least in the United States, was J.B. Watson. Okay, Watson was also a psychologist, I believe, at Harvard about 1910, et cetera. Now, he got in trouble for having, I think, an affair with a student, and he got bounced out of Harvard. And he ended up doing what? Madison Avenue. Watson was the guy that constructed a lot of the 1920s and 30s, along with a guy named Bernays, advertising, and so on and so forth. Of course, this is one of the things you see. Madison Avenue is the idea if you put a pretty girl in front of a car, and this came up heavily in the 40s and 50s, it was better to sell the car. The idea was to sell the car because it would attract women. In other words, it was sexual. Okay, that's J.B. Watson. Watson was the precursor of Skinner. And this is what they're dealing with. It really was oriented and organized to create changes in behavior to control the economic activity. And Skinner was a little bit later, and it was more accepted at that point, so they didn't go through the same thing. But it starts with this stuff. That's what Madison Avenue is. Yeah.
I also want to say that this Obamacare thing that he has for law, he's actually going to do whatever he can to force everybody to accept the microchip.
Mhm.
And this is what I've heard, and I hope you guys don't take this as an offense, because I've heard this is actually the mark of the beast, the microchip, and they're going to put these people in these FEMA camps and force them to accept the microchip, or else they're going to have their heads chopped off. That's what his plan was. And that's what his
I
plan
don't know, look, in a certain sense, the only thing I could say is they don't have to go that far. Their whole idea, we have put out some strategic studies in the 1970s, 74, 75, by the Executive Intelligence Review and so forth, called Fascism with a Democratic Face. And after World War II, one of the big problems that they had was if you came on too heavy with the straight Nazi approach or a fascist approach, people were at least somewhat against that. They had just fought a war against it. So the idea was, how do you get the actual acceptance of policies by simply convincing people or arranging their behavior so that they'll accept it. And take the question of zero growth. Take this whole environmentalism, right? There are too many people, there's too much growth, there's too much science, there's too much this and that. Well, what's the conclusion that you come? If there's zero growth, then you have to accept the fact that we're going to be running out of resources. You might stretch it out a little bit, but eventually it's going to run out. Therefore, we have to prepare now for less and less and less. So we have to have less people and less of a lifespan. And the whole idea was to get people to accept that as their own choice. And I say again, to me, look at what they've done. I saw this, look at what they've done with children. I see 10-year-olds, or, like my wife and I just visited her niece and nephew in Denmark. And what are these kids being taught? They're being taught, don't pollute, don't have styrofoam cups, don't do this, don't have plastic. Sure, some of these things fine, you know, but this is not life. This isn't what you're all about. And some of them are just silly. Like every society that goes through growth, for example, people will point out there's tremendous pollution in Beijing. There is. Now, how do you get rid of pollution? You increase the capability of the production of society. We had pollution. We had all this, in the end of the 19th century, smokestack pollution. What did we do? We improved the productivity. We advanced the science and technology. For example, the cleanest form of energy today that I know of is nuclear energy. Even some of the Greens are beginning to admit that. No carbon, even though we could use carbon, don't worry, I'm not, but still, nuclear energy, clean as a whistle. Fusion energy, cleaner than anything you can produce.
But we don't have, we're less 5,600 factories in this country all went overseas. We don't have, we don't have the opportunity to pollute ourselves because we're not making anything.
Well, that's what we have to do now. We have to bring it back and cooperate with these other countries.
I haven't heard one word today about how we're gonna pull up the blue-collar worker and pull up the economy of the blue-collar workers. I haven't heard nothing.
Industry.
What we need to do, like Obama said, now he gave the coal industry 5 years to straighten up. His first term, he gave them 3 years, and they spent millions of dollars to do it. Then he gave them 5 years to do it. Why can't we say, okay, China, Japan, the rest of the world, you're going to meet our EPA standards within 5 years, or we're not going to bring that crap over to the United States. Keep your rice rockets.
Because look, here's the problem. Of course we said things about blue collar. First of all, we're the ones who have defended the Detroit blue collar workers on the pensions, on all these things.
Right.
As a backup, we got a guy who's going to be running for office out there and so forth. But the way you really build up the blue collar workforce is you develop front end projects. If we have NWAPA, which I haven't mentioned in detail, but if we have NWAPA, a water project for the western parts of the United States, you're going to, not only are you going to employ blue-collar workers, okay, but you're going to raise the skill level of the entire economy. Like when I was at the plasma lab, this is exactly the point that they brought up. Yeah, they used to have 1,300 people at the lab. Okay, now this included technicians, engineers, skilled blue-collar workers, etc. They now have 450, and they're going to have less. Now, if we do this right, okay, we're going to have a shortage of labor, and we're going to take some of the younger workers and put them through the development of their skills. And the way you do it is you take retired workers, or nearly retired workers, and you bring their skill level to rapidly educate the younger generation. And I'll tell you something. We don't need this kind of idea about China and Japan. Look, they don't want to pollute. They want fusion economy. They want nuclear economy. Who produces nuclear energy in the world? You got two main producers, Areva and Westinghouse. Now, Westinghouse has been bought out by a Japanese company, Toshiba. Okay? So what we do, frankly, in this case, if we begin to produce nuclear facilities into fusion, we would be employing people in the United States. And we would be developing new industries. They don't want pollution. We can work with them on pollution. So if you try to impose an EPA on them without economic development or advanced science and technology, they're going to say no.
They're going to take
Hey,
it
wait a
out of our
minute, wait.
business. Like they did.
We've got to have the tax base and have the money to do it.
Yeah,
But we haven't got the tax base because we've sent all the blue-collar
that's
jobs
right.
overseas.
So we should have the blue-collar jobs here by expanding the number of blue-collar jobs that are needed internationally.
But you've got to have the tax base to do it.
That'll give you the
You
tax
can't
base.
ship the jobs overseas.
I'll tell you how you get the tax base now. This is
Okay.
what a credit system is. You take a lot of first of all, you wipe out all the crap in Wall Street. You
Oh,
wipe
wait a
the
minute,
garbage out. You wipe out all the speculation. You say, Wall Street, you're bankrupt. First of all, that would save us hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars.
And put her and I on welfare.
No, no.
Well, we live on stock dividends. We're
Yes.
retired.
There are ways to make the stock dividends that are valuable paid or extended into Social Security or do something. We can't bankrupt the country. We will take care of all the retired citizens. They're not going to be taken care of now.
Yeah, look at Detroit.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's what I'm saying.
So
So we've
look at how
got
far
to take this.
the people in California, CalPERS, they're behind by $100 billion
Yeah. Why?
because of all the blue collar jobs over in China.
It's also
Japan,
because, look, we just,
Germany. Look at
yeah,
Germany.
but that's
They're
what Wall
blossoming
Street
now.
wanted. That's what Wall Street wanted, cheap labor.
And our EPA chased them out of this country.
No, Wall Street chased them out before the EPA.
Right.
We were in business. You can't believe the regulations we had to deal with. We had,
My brother went out, I know it, but see, frankly, what's happened is, all this has gotten piled on,
Right.
because Wall Street doesn't want to pay for labor in the United States. Okay? And so they're willing to dump more and more of it in this form. Take what's going on with the states. What happened with the blowout? The income to the states dropped. They based themselves on stock gains. Capital gains was the basis for the bubble in California. And when that blew, what got cut? California. The labor force, skilled labor, aerospace, all that got cut. So what you got to do is get rid of Wall Street, and then we can deal with sane environmentalism versus insane environmentalism. I have no argument with the
Wall Street
environmentalists.
is part of the government. The government allowed that to happen, so why?
Wall Street's not part of the government.
Well, indirectly it is.
They're not, no, see, this is where we've been brainwashed. They're not part of the government.
But part of,
They're the enemy.
the government gets paid by Wall Street.
No, it doesn't. We pay Wall Street.
They don't get paid from doing business.
We just
over
paid
China.
them $700 billion.
The government doesn't get paid doing
No.
business over in China?
No,
No?
the government, look,
Then they should make those companies illegal that operate.
everybody, every decent president,
Why don't they make those companies illegal that
we're
operate?
not making it illegal, but we don't have to be, what we've done is, we've gone into a system whereby the private banks run financial policy. That's where you get too big to fail. What does it mean to be too big to fail?
Forced to shop at Walmart.
It's insane.
Yeah.
Too big to fail. They were allowed, and they've gotten bigger.
All of the money trail.
Yeah, but it's not the government. Let me give you an example.
That's a big part of it.
What? It's not part of it.
Laws. They
No,
make the laws.
George Washington and Alexander Hamilton said explicitly that we don't need monetarism. We will have a national bank, which we've only had a couple times in the history of the country. That's a whole other story. We've got some pamphlets on it. And the national bank will issue federal credit. The private banking system does not run the government.
So you don't think the government's a mafia system that? is
No,
just-
not really. Not George
Not really.
Washington and
Not his
No.
government, but our president.
The present government's no good, but that's us. We put these people in.
But they're making choices that are corrupt.
Then maybe we should,
Illegal.
then we should be fighting to change the system. We have the
But the vote
basis for
doesn't work.
changing the
Both
system.
Democrat and Republican, I'm saying.
Then we have the basis for changing the system. Look, what did
They're not
Lincoln
gonna
do?
give up, they're gonna follow the status quo.
No, they can be changed. They're facing a total
I'm not
crisis.
gonna wait the rest of my lifetime for them to change.
No, who's saying wait? We have to do it now.
That's why we're here. It's just.
But we've got to take the responsibility.
You haven't done it your whole life. A lot
No,
of
I
people
do
have
it.
come and gone, haven't done it.
But that's how you do it. That's how Lincoln did it. When Lincoln went to war with the South, look, people don't know American history. And when the Civil War started, okay, Lincoln, what was the Civil War? It was not just the South. It was Wall Street and Boston and London against the United States. The entire Southern cotton economy, as rotten as it was, and it was slavery, and it was rotten, was financed by Wall Street and London.
So if the government has no power to change that, why do we change government?
We did it.
Why do we change?
We
government?
did it because Lincoln came in and he said, we're going to fight against the Confederacy when they went off at Sumter. He went to Wall Street because they needed money to raise an army. And Wall Street said no. Wall Street said, we're going to charge you 10 and 20% interest. So what did Lincoln do? Lincoln said, okay, we don't need Wall Street. We're going to create the greenbacks. We're going to create a federal credit. We're going to create federal money. And what we did was we built the biggest economy in the world. We built the railroad to Sacramento. I think it was one of the terminal points. We started during the Civil War.
Right.
The reason the West Coast was built up. Now, you say, what did McKinley do? He did the same thing.
Yeah.
What did Franklin Roosevelt do? Look at his inaugural address. He said, we're going to chase the money changers out of the temple. And he took on Wall Street, and he took on the speculators, and we had Glass-Steagall, and we put some of them in jail. What did Kennedy do? Kennedy was threatening to change the charter of the Federal Reserve. Now what happened is, since then, we've become moral cowards.
And we've built a strong China. Now, we're gonna build a bullet train here in California.
No, we're probably not.
Well, maybe not. But the steel, the rail is gonna come from China.
Yeah.
Why? Because the EPA has shut down all our steel plants in the United States.
It wasn't the EPA, it was the financial system.
Okay,
That was
they got
secondary.
shut down, whoever. Now, we just got done building a Bay Bridge.
Right.
That steel came from China.
Yeah.
Now we're tearing down the Obey Bridge and sending it back to China to be recycled.
So what are we angry at China for? They're not doing this.
We are.
Yeah.
We're dumb enough to do it.
No,
Now we're building a strong China. Now they're.
No,
they
that's
build-
not,
they-
we're
they
building
build
a
our
weak
military
America.
equipment. They build our tanks. They build, because we have no way to do it. We have no steel plants.
Because we chose to do that because we're run by Wall Street.
Okay, we better stand up and say,
And the
hey,
Chinese,
now
no, the
is the
Chinese are
time
gonna
to
stand
stop
up.
this.
We better make friends with the Chinese because they're willing to work with us. They'll put 30% into a stellarator and we can't find a nickel.
But why? Because we haven't got a tax base. Because the EPA has shut
China's
everything
tax
down
base
in
is
the
bigger than
United
ours.
States and shipped it overseas.
China's tax base is bigger than ours.
What was that?
China's tax base is bigger than ours.
No, but
No.
no.
No, so they're doing it and we're not. Because we pay Wall Street. We're creatures. We're toadies of Wall Street. And we tolerate it.
And, yeah, but if the government's making laws that are against our Constitution, they can
We
make
can
laws.
change it. There's no law that says we have to back Wall Street.
No, I'm talking about our American Constitution, that the government, our government can make laws to take away rights and change the
They
Constitution.
can't do that.
Well, they're doing it. They can make.
No,
they can make
we're
us-
letting it happen.
I know. So they can make the same laws to change Wall Street and boot them out.
Yeah, called Glass-Steagall. That's what we're fighting to do.
Right.
You take
So that's the
Glass-Steagall and you
government.
bankrupt Wall Street.
So why haven't they done it so far? They're corrupt.
But no, it's us. We haven't demanded it.
Oh, yeah, we have. They don't listen to us.
No, they don't. Too many of our
They don't
people,
listen to us.
too many of our people say, I've got investments in Wall Street.
Right.
What about my money?
Okay.
I have a choice, and I don't have to invest in Wall Street. I can invest in the small
Main
businessman.
Street.
Main Street.
I can invest in, exactly, Main Street.
But there is no Main Street.
There is.
It's small. It's still there because I'm doing it today.
But we gotta take the country back.
Exactly.
Okay, we gotta take the whole damn thing back. Think a little bigger. We're in charge of this country.
But immediately, like this gentleman here said, you know, at a particular age, you don't have that choice of going back and rebuilding. Therefore,
Yes, you
you
do.
need a vehicle.
This is why I say we're more than our mortal flesh. Look, I'm not that much younger than most of you guys. I don't know, it's probably some substantially older, but not, I'm 66, I'm not a youngster. Okay? I happen to have some medical problems. I won't go into in detail because it's not a matter of sympathy.
Pre-existing.
Okay? I have some pre-existing conditions.
You're not gonna get treatment.
All right? Now,
It's not funny.
I have to say to myself at a certain point, am I gonna make a change in this country and run the risk of certain things, like a soldier?
Yep.
When you sign up for World War II, or one of the few just wars, you say to yourself, well, I might not come out the other end. But am I better off avoiding it? Now, I went through the Vietnam period. Some of you are probably veterans. I'm not. Okay? Because it was not the world's greatest war to get involved in. But when you have a decent war, a just war, and I think in under any cases you have to go through what you have to go through, and sometimes the country makes a mistake. Doesn't mean that the guys who went in made a mistake. But the fact of the matter is, you have a just war, and you know you go in that, and what makes people a little better, they go into that war, and they know that they're doing something of value that has to be done. And if you certainly do, you don't want to lose your life, but you risk your life. You look at some of what came out of the Civil War. You had soldiers in the Civil War who came out, in a sense, morally and intellectually better than they went in. Because it was a just war. And the war became more just as it went along. Because when they went in, they were fighting for the Union, and that was the right thing to do. But at a certain point, it became the Union and ending slavery. And that made the war even more just, even more moral. And so they came out better. So I'm not saying that there aren't some risks in these things. But the risk the other way around is you get to the end of your life, and you have to say, what was it all about? Maybe I'm at this point, and it's going to hell, and I didn't do enough to change it.
I totally agree with all what you're saying. But at the home front, we have families, we have, there's a financial support that we do. And we still, at this point, we can move our money from Wall Street. And if more of that was to take those retirements and find the vehicles that'll give us a return, we'll earn money for ourselves to support ourselves, that's going to put a hinder on Wall Street.
Well, I think the problem we got to face right now is...
And there is a bigger value in war, as you explained.
There's two things. Number one, Wall Street right now, the 6 major banks, have a big enough stranglehold of the situation that they're going to cut it off at a certain point. They have ways. Now, secondly, we're so close. Look, maybe I didn't stress this enough. Number one, we're at the brink of war. And I mean the real deal. And anybody who thinks that this is not serious over the next weeks and months ahead just doesn't get what's going on in Ukraine and elsewhere. Number two, there is motion to stop it. We have negotiations on Syria, we have negotiations on Iran, and we could make a turn in the strategic situation. But number three, this financial system, I'll say to you right now, probably ain't going to make it a whole lot longer. This is going to blow just like it did in 2008, only bigger.
Yeah, we're at war
It's
here.
global. Europe is going to go. This is going to go. So the only thing you can really do, and sometimes you have to act knowing that this is the future. Sure, if you take today and just extend it linearly, you might say, we're just going to go on at this level, and it's going to be bad, it's going to be bad, it's going to be bad, it's going to be bad. And it never seems like it's going to get worse. Well, I say we're at the point where the whole thing is going to blow out. And therefore, the sense of security you have, I'm sorry to say, I don't think it's going to last much longer. And so you got to decide.
So that what you're saying is that the total analogy is that everybody's personal wealth is going to go away.
Right.
All that's left on the table is a movement.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And to get certain things done. Yeah. Somebody else?
Okay, so if I wanted to make a difference, and now since I found this group, I feel like I have the political stance to have some help doing that. I was wondering would it be unconstitutional to challenge? I mean, I know that laws are made that are unconstitutional. I think a good step towards that would to be challenging the laws that are actually keeping us enslaved as people, and I was wondering, I'm willing to go to court, and have a big trial just to fight for our rights, but I'm willing to go to jail in order to fight for my rights. I was wondering, do they have the authority to be above the law if I wanted to do that?
Well, they don't have the authority to be above the law, but ultimately we're going to have to enact the law, we're going to have to fight for the law. I think it's still there if the American people move. I think right now, the first thing we have to do, look, we have the NSA problem with Snowden, that's real, but you've also seen what one person can do. He did it, he blew the story, other people may blow the story. The second thing we've got to do is take the power out of Wall Street. We've got to fight. We have 2 bills in Congress 2 bills in the Senate. We have people in Washington, D.C. We have a campaign by Keisha Rogers in Texas against Cornyn, which is going to be a national platform for Glass-Steagall for the follow-up. So this kind of organizing, I would say to somebody as young as you are, not just taking a court case, but joining the LaRouche Political Action movement, doing the organizing people, getting to Washington, D.C., and also a level of intellectual development. Because particularly for the younger crowd, we have a program of beginning to understand science, culture, the history of the United States. Look, one of the biggest impacts that we've had, and I think you're going to see more of it, is on November the 22nd, which was the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Kennedy, we did a memorial concert in Washington, D.C., Mozart's Requiem, which was done by people who work with us and some musicians. We took this to the National Black Congressional Caucus over the weekend, Keisha Rogers. And this moved people. People want to see what more we can do to elevate the population's thinking. When you get people to think back as to what we once were, because that's part of the whole thing about Kennedy, not the personal issue alone. You begin to see something, what if the future, what if you were back in 1963 and you could see where we were headed and you said, I'm going to change that, I'm going to stick with these policies. That in a sense is what LaRouche did.
Did you believe, or LaRouche believe that was conspiracy?
I believe, I definitely think Lynn does. I think there's no doubt in my mind that this was not Lee Harvey Oswald.
Right.
It was a group of people. We've done work on this. We have articles on it. We even, Jim Garrison, who was the basis for the movie, not the JFK that Stone did. Garrison worked with us. We were in touch with Garrison in the 70s after he got hit with some of this. And I think Garrison was basically on the right track. Whether it was every detail was exactly right. I think Mr. X was Mr. X. We, in fact, have a series of interviews, including Fletcher Prouty, that Jeff Steinberg interviewed. Prouty was basically the model for Mr. X in the movie. So yes, I think Kennedy was assassinated. Cornelius Gallagher, who's a congressman, was a personal friend of Kennedy, and we interviewed him also. And Gallagher's view is that Hoover was involved in it. I think, my view is certainly that this was a British, Canadian, Wall Street operation. For example, personally, here's an interesting example.
You can't do anything without the CIA.
No, the CIA, part of the CIA was probably involved in it.
Yeah.
But it's something above the CIA at a certain level. Because the CIA was, but take Lincoln. How many people today, maybe some people in this room, but a lot of people, most people today think he was killed by John Wilkes Booth. And the guy who pulled the trigger was Booth. Okay? So how many people know that William Seward was attacked the same night? His son was knifed. Stanton was attacked. There was one guy that was targeted on Grant, but Grant's wife got sick and they didn't go to Ford's Theater. Grant was supposed to sit right next to Lincoln. There were people hung for being part of the conspiracy to kill Lincoln. Most Americans have no idea of this.
It's a lot of history books
Right.
are wrong.
So yeah, the British have been out to destroy the United States from World War I.
Could you talk a little bit about what might be done in the political arena, the polarization of Republicans and Democrats? It's my opinion that everybody that's sitting in those seats, they honestly believe that they're doing the right thing. And so I've corresponded with my representatives, and some have been very positive and supportive, and one of them pretty much sent me back a letter that says, you know what, I hear what you're saying, but I don't agree with you, so.
They can't do it in over 200 years.
Well, I think, look, we do have to take, the thing we cannot do is depend on them. We've got to create a situation where we burn them and recognize that for some of them reality will hit. Now, for example, so I'm not just talking about possibility. You've got about 80 congressmen who have endorsed the Glass-Steagall bill. Now, the problem was that Capter, who was the sponsor, is a good woman. She's from Ohio, but she's not that dynamic, to put it bluntly, okay? Tierney from Massachusetts, And Jones from Carolina has just put forward a second bill. And they are much more intent on pushing it because they are extremely upset about what's happened with Dodd-Frank and the Volcker Rule. Then you have Elizabeth Warren in the Senate, who is serious about Glass-Steagall and will organize around it. Okay? Now, what's created this? We've been working on these people since 2008, and in particular since 2010. Cantwell in Washington. Okay, we were the ones that forced her to put it forward. She was hiding basically after 2010. So I think what you got to realize, there are individuals in the Congress who are movable. They're getting scared, and they'll be more scared if they hear from their constituents that this is a fundamental, existential, now urgent question. It's not a political game. Now, you do have bipartisan support. So you have Jones is a Republican, Tierney's a Democrat. Okay, you have McCain of all people, who I don't hold much truck with. But on the Warren bill, you got McCain, who's a Republican, King, who's an independent, and then you have Warren and Cantwell. So there are areas where this insane partisanship is breaking down. And we've got to make it clear, it's not an issue of party. Look, George Washington was against the party system. He didn't believe in the party. The two-party system is not part of the American Constitution.
What do you think about the Tea Party group that infiltrated the Republicans?
It depends. I think the Tea Party group goes two ways. I think there's a grouping in the Tea Party that is extremely upset about what's going on. A good example of this is Yoho from Florida. Ted Yoho is a freshman congressman from Florida. We've personally met with him. He actually called upon our members to explain Glass-Steagall at his town meeting. He just came out for Glass-Steagall, and he's a Republican. He represents, to me, the better part of the Tea Party. To be honest, there's a whole other grouping in the Tea Party who are just enraged, want small government, and I think they've been used by Wall Street, ironically enough, to cut the budget, to cut expenditures, to get people to think everything has to be cut. So there's two kinds of Tea Party.
Back to a smaller federal government and set up local governments where you can hold the politicians accountable.
The problem is, look, I tell you, you have to go back in American history. Having a country like this has its virtues if we keep it a united country.
It's
Now,
not united.
you have the Articles of Confederation. The whole country was formed because we couldn't function under the Articles of Confederation. The states were split off against one another and so forth. You need a federal government. That's what I would say.
Small.
You need a union.
A small government that you can manage, the people can manage, and then accountability.
We didn't manage a big government. We managed the big
We haven't.
We managed the
We
big
haven't
nation.
for the last 70 years.
Yeah, we got to take it back. We had 30 bad years before Roosevelt.
So how do you come out the cancer, the fat and the growth?
You get some healthy cells moving. Healthy cells moving. Target the rotten cells. Part of the job of cancer these days is, one of the improvements in cancer, it used to be chemotherapy, although I think we could do a lot better. Chemotherapy, you basically poison the whole system to kill the cancer cells. Now you can target the cancer cells, so the side effects of chemotherapy are
when
less.
they're targeting you with the NSA and everybody else.
Target back. NSA is blown. Now we've got NSA.
They got bigger guns.
But Snowden did it. No one even knew it until Snowden blew the
And
story.
he was running for his life. Well, I think a lot of people knew it, they just didn't want to admit it.
But now we have it public.
Yeah.
It's known.
So what can we do about it?
We can stop it.
How?
There's a bill by Sensenbrenner. There are people who have gotten upset about the way we pay. Look, I'll tell you how,
So
for one thing.
just lean on our
Yeah,
congressmen.
but organize people, the whole population, to raise it intellectual level.
Education.
Mind, it's the human mind.
Consciousness.
That's why I think we should go back just on our own, we the people, to local government and do our own manufacturing and.
I think we
our
can
own-
run a
do our
big
own
country.
business.
We need
I
big
think we gotta go
projects.
back
and big-
to our beginning, back to the beginning and just start.
But I said, in the beginning, in the beginning, we found, after the American Revolution, there was this sentiment. Every colony wanted to run its own show.
If you're motivated enough, it can have a
It
working
didn't
system.
work.
Hang
Some of
together.
the
That is
states,
separate.
some of our
Can't
states
be
want
wrong.
to do that same thing. They want to separate.
We don't want to
Some
be,
of them
we
want
don't want to be part of
The
the.
South wanted to secede. I was against that too,
We don't want to be part of the bigger cancer that's created that we don't.
But you have to, if people do that, they do it. But the fact is, we have a power as human beings And it's partly what's built into this country to fight back and take it back.
How about just say no, no Obamacare?
It won't happen, I assure you. Just saying no doesn't work. You've got to organize a political fight. You've got to lift the
That's part of
population.
saying no.
No, no is not enough.
No is the vote.
No is not enough. You've got to have a program that replaces it. And that's what we're putting forward. NWAPA, fusion, a Pacific orientation, scientific development, a cultural fight. You've got to have those things, otherwise you can't change it.
We need to educate the young next
Education,
generation
right.
coming up. They need to be educated and not in the universities, because the universities are teaching them exactly the opposite of what they should be learning. They're indoctrinating them in the university system. And I appreciate the fact that these young people showed up, because they're the ones who are gonna make the change.
Look,
And it's
LaRouche
going to affect them.
has made the point in recent papers, the whole question of education, this is what's being, and this is where, look, let me give you an example of something strange. Because I come from a certain standpoint. You know, I had an education, it was not great, but it was a little better than today. And I read some esoteric people. I read people most people wouldn't read. Maybe now they're reading, Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell probably was the most evil man of the 20th century, maybe leaving a few people aside. Now, what was he? He was a British philosopher. How many people know who Bertrand Russell was? Maybe they think of him as a peacemaker in the 1960s or something. Russell established certain epistemological principles that have become the dominant outlook of science and the leading elements of culture in the 20th century. Frankly, Bertrand Russell has more effect on the people in this room who may have never heard his name than most people that you've heard of. Because he dominated the way people thought about human beings. It was an anti-human, it was a version of science that's not really science. It's sort of science as what Lynn calls sense perception. You do a number of experiments, what's around you, that's what's true, what you know. When indeed there are principles that you never see, that are not part of sense perception, that are affecting what you as a human being experience. And Russell said, you can't know that. You can't know the future. You can't know principles.
Like
it's all just a guess.
Like all the deals made behind closed doors in Washington.
Yeah. Okay, and the idea is you can't know that. You can't intervene on that.
That's
You don't have a
okay.
mind.
Bypass them, go back to local government.
I don't think that's going to work in this world.
Well, don't, can't means won't.
I'm prepared to take on, 3.5 million square miles and 315 million people and take the legacy of the United States, which is to lead the world in being a republic and having an orientation to the future. And in that sense, there's an American exception. And that's what we have to recapture.
Are you running for president?
No, not recently.
There was another question.
Yeah.
Oh, I say no, but I mean, I don't buy stuff from corporations or anything. I just do everything that's healthy, and that's not enough. Nobody cares.
Yeah, it's not enough.
People don't care, no.
You got to take, human beings have a certain quality of universality. We think about the universal principles. We think about humanity as a whole. We're completely different than anything else. And we should take that and grab it back and use it. And like I say, you got to have the guts to tell these Wall Street. Look, I have an uncle who worked on Wall Street. I know, Wall Street is a mess. There's no principle in it. That's why these guys, 20% of them end up on cocaine. It's not a joke. Partly it's the tension of the job, but the stress of the job, because it's an insane job. It's 24 hours trying to gain a nickel on somebody.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's crazy.
Question. Do you have any kind of a feel for where people can actually get information that is really truthful?
Mm-hmm.
I've had personal dealings with the news media in the past, and you can guarantee one thing, that whatever you said will be twisted, contorted, and turned around. Which is what all of our perception is based on, the information that we get from the mass news media.
Don't watch the network
Yeah,
news.
I'm so ashamed of myself that I wasted so much time watching any morning program.
Network news.
Any network
I'll
news,
tell you,
any ABC.
The one place
NBC,
you're going to get truth, and we do more of it if we had more capabilities, manpower-wise and money-wise, is the LaRouchePAC website. And there's a lot of links off the LaRouchePAC website to EIR, to the Schiller Institute. The Schiller Institute is our cultural representation internationally. We have organization in Europe, we have organization in South America, we have some representatives in Africa, we have some people in Asia. I mean, we have people in Russia, and we're going to give you a different story than anybody else, but it requires people organizing with us, because one of the reasons our stories are different is it's organizing. We go out and do something and watch and get an idea how people respond, how the average citizen responds, how Congress responds, how Europe responds, and we put that on the website absolutely to the greatest of our capability. And we go in the street, and you see some of the people here. They go in the street and they organize other American citizens virtually every day of the week. We're around the country. We're in Florida, we're in California, we're in Washington, Northeast. We did things like the concert. We're going to do another concert in Boston in the middle of January.
Was that right at the square in Washington?
It was one of the major churches right outside.
Oh, okay, they won't let you in the square.
I don't know what the story was on that. We tried the national, I'm not about to say what happened on that, I don't know.
Right, no. But bigger picture, if people just listen to their own common sense and look at the bigger picture, is right in front of us, the truth. And have the courage to speak the truth to anyone you meet.
And then you have the ability to spread it out. That's what we do on LPAC, on all these sites.
We've got to stop being so stupid.
Yes.
We give foreign aid to Pakistan.
Yes.
We give foreign aid to Afghanistan. We give foreign aid to everybody. We give foreign aid to China. Now, why? And then we turn around and borrow money from China. Even my drunk uncle, he wouldn't be that stupid.
I tell you, China's right now doing more to support us than other stuff. But look, the basic point, what are these stories real? I mean, yes, how do we get in Afghanistan? How do we get on, we allied with Pakistan against China. We went into Afghanistan like a bunch of fools.
Yeah.
Okay? Now what happened? Look, one thing Americans are going to have to get over, to get it, and this is a whole other story, we've got to talk about conspiracy. 9/11. 9/11 was done by the Saudis, the British, and elements in the United States. Forget all the things about the building. The fact of the matter is, we know that Bandar was tied to some of the people in San Diego, et cetera.
It was allowed to happen.
And you know what? There's now legislation by Stephen Lynch and Walter Jones, both people we've worked with, to expose the truth about 9/11.
And the truth about our government is they are a mafia organization, and their whole purpose is to extort money from people or wherever they can get it.
Well, even worse than that. Look, the Bush family, think about how many people thought the Bush family, that George Bush was a nice conservative. George Bush was an idiot. And George Bush, his family was completely involved in this stuff. He wasn't. I mean, who knows what he knew.
Evil does evil.
Okay? So we've got to take this stuff on. And if we get over the 9/11 freak out, we're a little bit less susceptible to all this other security stuff.
Distraction. And we've got such a big mountain to climb. I mean, from your kids being dumbed down by drinking fluoride in the water to aspartame to everything. There's just there's so much to catch up on.
Well, we gotta do
you
it.
need to educate. You need to, our only child that is interested in this, in her early 20s, 23 years old, worked as a nurse, and she was working it. I'm so upset that she actually had a shift, and she would have been here. And that's part of the thing that we have kids in their 20s, and we've always tried to educate and tell them the truth about everything. And it's a hard battle. It's a hard battle to eat right. It's a hard battle to feed them correctly and educate them correctly.
What do you think about the conspiracy to reduce the population down to 500 million?
Well, okay, we're a little more conservative than you are. We think they're trying to get to 1 billion out of 7.
Oh, 1 million?
1 billion.
Oh, I said 500 million.
Well, Schellenhuber says 500 million. The Queen has been quoted, Queen Elizabeth, at the Copenhagen conference in 2009, saying that she thought the population was better at 1 billion than 7 billion.
She's out of her mind.
It's a matter of,
It's all those people
I
that
think
won't
it's
get
the
cats.
general magnitude is there.
Well,
No, this is a
Those are
depopulation
the,
problem.
those are the people, ladies and gentlemen, those are the people that control everything, is
And we
the
put everything,
Bilderberg Group.
Yeah.
You need to
What-
research these and start spreading that word to our 20-something.
Well, that was, wasn't that the object of the Club of Rome back in the
Yeah.
60s, to
Yeah.
say, hey, we're limited, we're gonna have to limit everything, and
Exactly.
agriculture, we can't sustain this population, you know, and then agriculture
Look,
production's gone up.
the
and up.
fact of the matter is, you know, what happened back in the late 60s and early 70s.
Was
and
late,
it-
was
it-
late, was old news.
But this was, yeah, this actually goes back to the 20s,
Hundreds of years.
where you had in the United States racial profiling that the Nazis ultimately used.
California.
Count Pasadena,
Yeah.
Cold Harbor in Long Island, and so on and so forth. Now, we've done tons on this stuff, because it really hit full square with the pessimism of the 1960s. When you had the Kennedy assassination, the war, the country went to hell, and what happened was they came in with the youth after the so-called, what was really the rock, drug, sex counterculture, the anti-war movement.
Yeah.
They came in with environmentalism. And the big leading item was zero growth.
Yeah.
Okay, we wrote a pamphlet in 1972
Mhm.
entitled Zero Growth, Blueprint for Extinction.
Oh.
And we countered the entire story on zero growth
Right.
then,
Yeah.
in 72. And I'll tell you the truth, I had an experience where I was at the University of Washington, and we put up a banner that said, zero growth. I don't know, it said the fascism of the 20th century, blueprint for extinction. That's all we had was a banner over the student union.
Yeah.
Okay, 700 people showed up to hear Lyndon LaRouche. Okay, and we recruited a hell of a lot of people out of that. Now, the fact of the matter is, these are the kinds of flanks that we have to be bold and brash about. Up front, you know, and you go out and you tell these younger guys, you're gonna be destroyed by these people.
And take away some of the distractions. So many people, I mean, I'm again, I'm so upset with like Sacramento, our mayor, and the first thing on his mind is the Kings, the Kings, the Kings. There's so many distractions.
Basketball.
Is it still, what's his name?
Yeah, and he's just, yes, and he's just, everybody's trying, everybody thinks they're money.
We elected a jock.
Distracting, I know. And notice we're not in Sacramento, but, you know, but everybody needs to stop with their stupid football, stop with their stupid shopping, stop with their stupid, you know, all these distractions and start concentrating.
Look, football is a good example. It's a virtually gladiatorial. Now, on the other hand,
I know, I wish they'd throw a lion out there in the middle of two teams.
you know, basketball has a bad record because Dave Bing was the mayor of Detroit. He was a basketball player. They went bankrupt. And Johnson is out here. I just, you know, don't like the jock. It's deep.
Seriously.
We got, you know, who's leading the Ukrainian movement? The former super heavyweight boxer. Klitschko.
Oh, let's go, yeah.
The only one I agree with is Jesse Ventura.
Well, I think one good thing about the environmentalism was, I think what the environmental, I'm trying to look it up, I remember the environmentalist 10 Commandments. I don't know how this fits in, but if you agree with me, not the right to resist regimentation. Okay, that's one of their 10 Commandments, or whether it's not like, you have a right to speak your own mind, you know, that's the whole thing, you have that freedom, yeah, so, I don't know.
Here's the whole thing.
But you look at the
Yeah.
universal environmentalism,
Yeah.
that, you know, you can say we don't want to have, but the environmentalist movement is an anti-human, anti-science movement. The green culture is going to kill everything. It's it is true, the one point, we've imposed the green culture on ourselves. We've imposed no science. Look, you can't build a nuclear plant.
Right.
You can't, we're more terrified.
You can't build a big industry.
You can't do
put
anything.
people
I think
to
that's
work.
extreme environmentalism, though, there's common sense environmentalism.
But we've had this, look, John Kennedy spoke about
Yeah,
traditional conservation.
right.
Yes. Do we want green woods so that people can have a little fun and make it? Fine. Do we want a park? But look, I'll tell you something. You have to recognize what Teddy Roosevelt did in the late 19th, early 20th century, was he built the park system
Right.
to stop the development in the American West.
Right. And
That was the conscious
extremism, if you're gonna
idea.
say, you think it's
Nobody ever
extremism,
talks about,
extreme people get things done. Extremism is
Yeah.
correct.
radical.
I mean, radical, and the ones that let it happen are not extreme.
Yeah, the one thing you gotta recognize, the one thing I will say, I mean, in the policy, but look, here's where you get in trouble with Wall Street and the so-called enemy, and it's very simple. The typical average American and average citizen in most countries, they want to fight for something, but they don't have the stamina. They say, well, I'll fight today, and if it doesn't work, I'm going to quit tomorrow. If I win,
I guarantee.
if I win it, or I want a guarantee, or if I win a fight, why do I have to keep fighting? Now, I'll tell you something about Wall Street, or the oligarchy, or the Queen of England. They have a funny tenacity about them. They're going to keep fighting you until you stop them cold.
Right.
And you got to have that kind of tenacity.
And
You say, I'm not going to quit until they've been defeated and we've got ourselves on the right track.
And they want somebody to.
You know, I don't know if we have to execute them, probably not. We're better than that. But they're going to surrender. They're going to be under control.
I totally disagree with you. Now, take Standard Oil, for example. The profit is divided up and paid out as dividends. The dividends is what we live on, what the carpenters union lives on, the plumbers. If you do away with Wall Street, what are you going to do with all the retired people?
We'll have to figure out what to do. We'll make that part of what we do. What did Roosevelt do with Social Security?
Is it wrong for us to survive on
Not
our
when they're
dividends?
doing what they're doing. They're holding back progress. You're investing in holding back human progress. Exxon banks the greenback. You know who created the environmentalist movement? It was supported by the oil companies.
Right.
Shell,
And we
Royal
went
Dutch
along
Shell.
with it like a bunch of stupid people.
Well, that's why they went along, because it was their dividends. I don't say you shouldn't have your support. There are other ways to be supported. We don't have to depend on Wall Street to do it. These companies will exist.
What's going to happen
If you have investments in those companies, and they're legitimate investments, those investments will be taken care of and paid off over time, the way Roosevelt did exactly the same thing. When people were investing in banks that were closed down because of speculation, the legitimate part of the debt was paid over time. That's how we did it. I'm giving you a historical precedent. Exxon's not going to go out of business if Wall Street goes out of business.
No.
We can guarantee that oil companies stay alive,
Yeah.
that are investing in real development.
Yeah.
How about Google?
Even Google.
You can't get rid of everybody's retirement.
I'm
You
not
just
saying
can't.
you will.
No.
You're going
I
to
mean,
lose
are you
your
gonna-
retirement in the bubble that bursts right now.
Yeah.
Your retirement's at
But without
risk.
Google,
Lenin wanted to take care of everybody.
So did Roosevelt.
Yeah, so, okay. Kathy and I decided we're going to take care of ourselves. We're going to
That's
invest.
fine.
Good for
I
you.
just told you that legitimate investments will be protected. Wall Street just blew hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars. We're being strangled by it. And you're going to lose your investment on it. They're bankrupt.
Why is the government giving GE trillions of dollars to build solar farms and sell the energy back to us?
Because we've been fools about environmentalism.
Solar farms are a waste of money.
Oh, yeah, yes.
So why can't we just say no by design?
Because we're not going to have the ability to do what we need to do. We need to do things on a large scale. The space program would have been nothing without the federal government. No state was going to do the space program.
What about-
No state was going to build nuclear energy.
What about free energy from my ionosphere that costs us?
Back in the
You can't
60s,
get it that way. You still need the investment in the capital development who can use that.
back in the 60s, we had a tax base that we could
No, we
support.
can get, there's no such thing as free. You still got to build the equipment to use it.
Which is a lot cheaper than what PG&E is selling us.
Fine, we can do these things, but you've got to do it on a large scale or it won't happen.
Or building solar farms right in the developing communities where they're
Because
open
we
spaces.
let it happen.
Right.
As soon as the kid gets.
So why do we need any other alternate energy to invest in?
And solar energy?
And I'm scared.
Why haven't they built those solar farms within open space within the community and let the
Solar
commu-
energy is
and
a
let-
net loss.
and then let the community invest in it?
They won't do it. It's a net loss. We can't run a modern economy with solar energy. The energy flux density is too low.
Yeah, that's it.
They'll get interfered with by insects, as we found in the desert. It's not, you can't, it still requires the capital goods, you can't do it.
I just want to, by no means do I want to halt discussion, but I do want to bring up just a few things real quick, because I think the general sentiment right now is that, look, there's no easy way except we have to organize. We have to rack our own brains and think about everything, anything that we can do day in, day out to save this nation. And you know, that's going to take some creativity, it's going to take some collaboration, and it's going to take some expansion. Now, I just wanted to say a couple of things. Number one, if you haven't been to the LaRouchePAC website, you should definitely get on there, because there is tons of material on there on everything that Phil has brought up. Number two, every Thursday, we actually have a national activist call at 8 p.m. with hundreds of people from the West Coast. And it's a strategy session with our organizers and with other people like yourselves. It's very much like this town hall meeting, except on the phone. But you have it every single week. And this is crucial. This has actually yielded some really great results across the country on the Glass-Steagall fight, on the health care, on impeachment, on all kinds of areas where things that our organization on its own definitely could not have done have been possible because of people like people in this room, some of which are, you know, probably just meeting us for the first time. So before you leave today, you know, definitely go to the table over here and make sure you get the information for that. The third thing is that Monday morning, every person in this room should call up their member of Congress and our senators and bring up, first and foremost, the Glass-Steagall. You know, a lot of people in this room probably have McClintock as your congressman, not everybody. But he's somebody that for sure should be on for Glass-Steagall. And he's also somebody who could put forward a bill for impeachment. I don't know if people know, but he wrote an article last week in Breitbart saying the impeachable crimes of Obama and talking about this Judiciary Committee hearing on Tuesday. And this is a major discussion right now. So all we're lacking in the Congress right now is somebody who's willing to put their career on the line and put out a bill for impeachment. Let's get the momentum going. So if every person in this room called up McClintock's office, for example, or whoever your representative is, Democrat or Republican, and said, hey, why don't you do something about impeachment instead of just talking about it? Why don't you do something about Wall Street and get on with the Glass-Steagall bill? Why don't we do something about, you know, the insanity of the party leadership? That's something that we can do. We can call our friends and relatives and neighbors and fight with them to do the same.
What is LaRouche doing in order to create a third party that would really change the system?
So then,
Sorry.
Yeah, sure. So that's something you can do for sure. And then there was something else that I was going to bring up. Well, I guess I wanted to allow Miwa to say what she was going to say. Yeah.
So I think I thank everybody for taking the time and coming here and engaging in a very rigorous, attentive, concentrated discussion. And I'll leave you with my favorite quote from John F. Kennedy, which is, "A man may die, nations may rise and fall, but an idea lives on." And I think with the nature of what we've discussed, what our operation is nationwide is absolutely crucial. And we're out there on the streets, we're intervening in the state houses, on Capitol Hill, we're interfacing with people in this population. I think most of you were met actually on the streets, at a table that we put out there. In order to do that, we need fundamental backup from you. So with that, we take credit cards, we take checks, we take cash, and we appreciate all the contributions we can get because we use them to the fullest degree, and we use them well. So please make a contribution before you leave, because we intend to escalate through the holidays in an escalated fashion. We're not going to be shopping or going home to see mommy. We are our own adults, taking on responsibility for a lot. And I think everybody knows, every major fight in this country has been an uphill battle. It's not going to be easy, and I think most of us have a good moral conscience when we want to see something happen and we want to generate it. And that's the sense I've gotten from everybody here. Even though I haven't heard everybody speak, that's the climate of the discussion. So thank you very much, and you have organizers that are on their way out.
I'd just like to thank Phil for a great.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.